Picture yourself standing at the mouth of a cave in what will one day be called Europe. But this is 400,000 years ago, and Europe is unrecognizable. The air is cold enough to see your breath, even in summer. The landscape stretches before you, a mix of dense forest and open grassland. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are eyes watching from the shadows. You're not alone at this cave entrance. Your family is here, maybe 15 people total. Children huddled close to their mothers, a few males standing guard. You've come to this cave because your group desperately needs shelter, but there's a problem. This cave already has residents. Deep in the darkness, you can hear them breathing. Cave bears, massive creatures that stand over 10 feet tall on their hind legs, weighing close to a ton. And they're not happy about visitors. This is the world where Neanderthals began. Not as the powerful hunters you might imagine, not as apex predators who feared nothing. No, they started as prey, as competitors, as creatures fighting for survival in a landscape absolutely dominated by carnivores that were bigger, faster, and far more deadly than any predator alive today. The Pleistocene epoch, the time we're talking about, was ruled by what scientists call the Carnivore Guild. Think of it as a deadly alliance of hunters, all competing for the same resources, all willing to kill each other for territory, for food, for caves. At the top of this hierarchy sat the cave lion, Panthera spelaea. These weren't the lions you see in Africa today. These were monsters. Males could weigh up to 770 pounds, standing 4 feet tall at the shoulder. They hunted in the darkness. Their enormous eyes adapted for nighttime ambushes. Their jaws could crush bone. Their claws could disembowel a bison with a single swipe, and they were everywhere. Cave lion fossils appear across Europe, across Asia, all the way to Siberia. They dominated the open steppes, the forest edges, the river valleys. Every prime hunting ground belonged to them first. Every kill they made, they defended viciously. And if you were a small group of early Neanderthal ancestors trying to survive in this landscape, cave lions were your nightmare. The thing that hunted you when you ventured too far from camp. The shadow that took members of your group who wandered alone. But cave lions weren't hunting alone. They had competition, and that competition made life even more dangerous for everyone else. Cave hyenas, Crocuta spelaea, ran in packs across the Pleistocene landscape. These weren't like modern hyenas. They were larger, more robust, built for crushing bones and tearing through the thick hides of megafauna. And they had a particular talent that made them especially dangerous. They were bone crushers. When a cave hyena pack found a carcass, they didn't just eat the meat. They cracked open every long bone, extracting the marrow. They crunched through skulls to get at the brains. They left nothing behind except fragments and splinters. And if your group of Neanderthal ancestors managed to bring down a deer or a horse, and a pack of hyenas caught the scent, you had seconds to decide. Fight for your kill and probably die, or abandon it and go hungry. The fossil record tells us exactly how dangerous this world was. When scientists examine Neanderthal skeletons from this period, they find trauma. Lots of trauma. Healed fractures that tell stories of survival. Unhealed wounds that tell stories of death. One comprehensive study looked at 124 Neanderthal specimens from across their entire range. The numbers are staggering. 36% showed evidence of bear attacks. 21% bore the marks of big cat predation. 17% had injuries consistent with wolfpack assaults. That's 74% of all Neanderthal remains showing signs of attacks by large carnivores. Think about what that means. 3 out of every 4 Neanderthals whose bones we've found were attacked by predators at some point in their lives. Many died from these attacks. Others survived, carrying scars and broken bones for the rest of their days. This wasn't occasional violence, this was constant warfare. A daily struggle to avoid becoming dinner for something bigger and stronger. The cave bears deserve special attention because they competed with Neanderthals for the exact same resource: caves. In Ice Age Europe, caves weren't just nice shelter, they were survival. When temperatures dropped to Siberian levels, when blizzards howled across the steppes, a cave could mean the difference between living and freezing to death. But caves were limited, and cave bears knew their value as well as any hominin did. Ursus spelaeus, the cave bear, wasn't even primarily carnivorous. Modern analysis suggests they were mostly vegetarian, feeding on plants and roots, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. An adult male cave bear weighed 100 pounds. They were territorial, they were protective of their cubs, and they needed caves for hibernation. Every autumn, cave bears would retreat into the deepest, darkest parts of cave systems to sleep through the winter, and woe to anything that disturbed them. The evidence of this competition appears in caves across Europe. In Sophie's cave in Germany, archaeologists found something remarkable. Cave bear bones with carnivore damage, puncture marks and chewed ends. But mixed among them were stone tools, Neanderthal tools. The two species were using the same cave, probably at different times, but sometimes those times overlapped. And when they did, violence followed. Some cave bear vertebrae show large carnivore bite damage. Some have cut marks from stone tools. The bears hunted Neanderthals. The Neanderthals hunted bears. Nobody was safe. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from what scientists call predation rates. When paleontologists study carnivore dens, places where predators brought their kills to consume, they find bones, lots of bones, and some of those bones are hominin, not many because hominins were never the preferred prey. They were too smart, too dangerous, too much trouble, but they were prey nonetheless. Young Neanderthals who wandered too far from the group, injured adults who couldn't keep up, the old, the weak, the unlucky. In one cave in Spain, researchers found something chilling. Neanderthal bones with cave hyena teeth marks. The bones had been cracked open for marrow, just like the hyenas did to deer and horses. The message was clear. To the hyenas, a Neanderthal was just another meal, just another source of protein. The idea that hominins were somehow special, somehow exempt from the food chain, would have seemed absurd to a hungry hyena. And then there were the wolves. Canis lupus spelaeus, the Ice Age wolf, hunted in coordinated packs. They were tactical. They isolated prey from herds. They worked together to bring down animals much larger than themselves. And they weren't intimidated by upright walking apes. Wolf packs could harry a group of Neanderthals for miles, waiting for someone to stumble, to fall behind, to show weakness. The moment they did, the pack would strike. This was the world that shaped Neanderthals. A world where every day was a gamble, where leaving your cave meant potentially never coming back, where the smell of blood from a successful hunt could bring death from a dozen directions, where the strong carnivores claimed the best hunting grounds, the best kill sites, the best territories. And what was left over, the scraps, the margins, the dangerous in-between places, that's where our Neanderthal ancestors tried to survive. But survival meant more than just avoiding predators. It meant competing with them. And here's where things get interesting, because early Neanderthals weren't helpless. They had advantages. They had hands that could grip and manipulate. They had brains that could plan and remember. They had social bonds that let them cooperate in ways solitary predators couldn't match. They had something that cave lions and hyenas and wolves didn't have. They had potential. The fossil evidence suggests that by about 400,000 years ago, proto-Neanderthals, the ancestors who would eventually become the Neanderthals we recognize, were starting to fight back. Not successfully, not yet, but they were learning. They were adapting. They were beginning the long, brutal transformation from prey to predator, from the hunted to the hunters. And that transformation would take hundreds of thousands of years. It would require changes to their bodies, their tools, their social structures, their entire way of understanding the world. It would mean facing down the most dangerous predators that ever walked the earth and saying, no, not today. You don't get to kill us today. Today we survive, and tomorrow, maybe tomorrow we start to win. This is their story, the story of how a vulnerable group of clever apes looked at a world designed to kill them and decided to become something it had never seen before. Something that would eventually make cave lions go extinct. Something that would hunt cave bears to the edge of oblivion. Something that would turn the entire carnivore guild on its head. This is the story of how Neanderthals rose from prey to predator. But Neanderthals didn't appear out of nowhere. They didn't just spring into existence as a new species one day, fully formed. Evolution doesn't work that way. They inherited something, a foundation, a starting point that was already impressive, already successful, already surviving in this brutal world. They inherited the legacy of Homo heidelbergensis, go back 600,000 years ago. Europe is in the grip of an ice age, but it's the warm period between glacial advances. The landscape is mixed, forests and grasslands interwoven, and roaming through it is a species of human that's been remarkably successful. Homo heidelbergensis, they're tall, averaging around 5 feet 9 inches, they're robust, heavily muscled, and they have brains that are impressively large, averaging around 200 cubic centimeters. That's getting close to modern human brain size. These weren't primitive creatures, they were making sophisticated tools, they were hunting large game, they were using fire, probably controlling it, almost certainly understanding its power to transform their world, and they were spreading. Heidelbergensis fossils appear across Africa, across Europe, all the way into Asia. They were one of the most successful hominin species to ever exist. And from them, in the cold crucible of Ice Age Europe, something new was emerging. The transformation happened slowly, so slowly that if you could watch it generation by generation, you'd barely notice the changes. A slightly thicker brow ridge here, a more robust jaw there, limbs becoming gradually shorter, bodies becoming more compact. The changes were subtle, but they were directional. They were adapting to something specific, the cold. Northern Europe during the Middle Pleistocene was nothing like today's Europe. Glaciers advanced and retreated in cycles lasting tens of thousands of years. When the ice came, it covered everything. Scandinavia vanished under miles of ice. Britain became a frozen wasteland. The Mediterranean became a refuge, the only place where forest could survive. And every time the ice advanced, populations had to move or die. But some populations didn't move. They stayed. They adapted. And the adaptations they developed would become the foundation of the Neanderthal body plan. Shorter limbs conserved heat by reducing surface area. A barrel-shaped chest could house larger lungs to warm frigid air before it reached sensitive lung tissue. Wider noses could humidify and heat air more efficiently. A stockier build minimized the surface area to volume ratio, crucial for retaining body heat in sub-zero temperatures. This is called Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule in modern biology. Animals in colder climates tend to be larger and more compact than their warm climate relatives. It's physics. Heat radiates from surfaces. The less surface area you have relative to your volume, the less heat you lose. Neanderthals were evolving into cold climate specialists, and their bodies show it in every bone. By about 430,000 years ago, the earliest fossils we'd recognize as proto-Neanderthal start appearing. The Cima de los Huesos site in northern Spain contains bones from at least 28 individuals. They died together, possibly in some kind of accident or disaster, and their bones accumulated in a deep pit where they were protected from scavengers and weathering. These bones are remarkable because they show the Neanderthal body plan already taking shape. The skulls are long and low, the brow ridges are prominent, the faces project forward with huge nasal openings. The bodies are heavily built with thick bones and large muscle attachment sites. These weren't quite Neanderthals yet. Scientists call them pre-Neanderthals or proto-Neanderthals. But the direction was clear. They were becoming something new, something adapted for a specific niche that no other hominin had successfully exploited. They were becoming cold-adapted ambush predators. But the cold adaptation was only part of the story. Because at the same time their bodies were changing, their brains were growing. And this is crucial. A larger brain means more neurons, more processing power, more capacity for memory and planning and social coordination. The Neanderthal brain would eventually average 1,520 cubic centimeters. That's larger than the modern human average of 1,400 cubic centimeters. They weren't just strong, they were smart. And they needed to be smart because they were developing something revolutionary. A new way of making tools that required more cognitive power than anything that came before. It's called the Levallois technique, and it's so sophisticated that when archaeologists first studied it, they couldn't believe that Neanderthals had invented it. It seemed too complex, too planned, too intelligent for creatures they'd long dismissed as brutish cavemen. Here's how the Levallois technique works. You start with a rock, a core of flint or chert. But instead of just hitting it randomly to knock off flakes, you prepare it first. You carefully shape the core, removing flakes around the edges to create a domed surface that looks like a turtle shell. You prepare a striking platform at one end, and then, with a single precise strike, you remove a large flake that's already the right shape for whatever tool you need. A point, a blade, a scraper. The shape is predetermined. You know what you're making before you make it. This requires planning. It requires understanding three-dimensional geometry. It requires being able to hold in your mind the shape of something that doesn't exist yet, and then bringing it into being through a precise sequence of actions. Modern humans can learn this technique, but it takes practice and instruction. It's not intuitive. It's not something you figure out by accident. Someone had to invent it. Someone had to teach it. And that someone was the ancestor of Neanderthals. The Levallois technique appears in the archaeological record around 400,000 to 300,000 years ago, right when proto-Neanderthals were emerging, right when their brains were growing and their bodies were adapting to the cold, and it spread from Europe to the Middle East, across to Central Asia. Everywhere Neanderthals went, Levallois tools appeared. It was their signature, their calling card, their proof of cognitive sophistication. But sophisticated tools weren't enough on their own. You needed the body to use them effectively. And this is where the Neanderthal physical inheritance really becomes important. Because the bodies they inherited from Heidelbergensis, and then refined over hundreds of thousands of years, were built for power. Look at the upper limbs. Neanderthal arm bones are thick, not just dense, but actually thicker in diameter than modern human bones. The attachment sites for muscles, places where tendons anchored to bone, are massive, pronounced. They stick out from the bone in ridges and bumps that tell scientists exactly how big those muscles were, and the answer is very big. Studies comparing Neanderthal muscle attachment sites to modern humans find that Neanderthals had significantly greater upper body strength. We're not talking about being a little stronger. We're talking about strength levels comparable to modern Olympic athletes in power sports, weightlifters, wrestlers, people who train their entire lives to maximize muscular power. Neanderthals had that naturally, from birth, as their baseline. The hand bones tell the same story. Neanderthal hands were large with thick finger bones and powerful grips. Their thumbs were long and strong. Studies show they could touch their thumb to their index finger with as much dexterity as modern humans, giving them fine motor control for precise work. But they could also grip with tremendous force, the kind of force you need to hold onto a spear that's being rammed into a struggling, dying mammoth. And the shoulder structure. Neanderthal shoulders were broad and heavily muscled. The scapula, the shoulder blade, shows attachment points for muscles that modern humans barely use. Muscles that stabilize the arm during powerful overhead movements. Muscles that let you thrust downward with your entire body weight behind the blow. These were shoulders built for close combat hunting, for delivering killing strikes with handheld weapons, for wrestling with prey that fought back. The spine and torso complete the picture. Neanderthal vertebrae are thick and robust. The rib cage isn't cylindrical like ours. It's bell-shaped, wider at the bottom than the top. This shape had multiple advantages. It provided more room for the lungs and diaphragm, allowing for greater oxygen intake. It lowered the center of gravity, improving stability, and it allowed for more powerful rotation of the trunk, crucial for generating force in throwing or thrusting movements. Recent studies suggest this bell-shaped thorax gave Neanderthals explosive power, the ability to generate tremendous force in short bursts. Think of the difference between a marathon runner and a sprinter. Marathon runners are lean, efficient, built for endurance. Sprinters are heavily muscled, explosive, built for maximum power output over short distances. Neanderthals were sprinters. Their entire body plan was optimized for brief, intense bursts of activity. And there's genetic evidence to back this up. When scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, they found variants of genes associated with muscle development and athletic performance in modern humans. Specifically, they found more variants associated with power and sprint athletes than with endurance athletes. Neanderthals were genetically predisposed to be powerful, fast in short bursts, explosive. But this body plan came with costs. Big muscles require lots of calories. Explosive power requires lots of fast-twitch muscle fibers, which tire quickly. The Neanderthal metabolism was faster than ours, burning through energy at a higher rate. They needed more food than a modern human of the same size. Much more. Some estimates suggest Neanderthals needed anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 calories per day just to maintain their body mass and activity levels. This created a feedback loop. They needed lots of food. The best source of concentrated calories in their environment was meat. To get meat, they needed to hunt. To hunt successfully, they needed power and strength. Their bodies provided that power, but demanded even more food to sustain it. They were locked into a high-risk, high-reward strategy. Hunt successfully or starve. There was no middle ground. And they were inheriting something else. Something less tangible but equally important. Social bonds. Heidelbergensis had lived in groups. They'd cooperated. They'd shared food and shelter. The evidence for this is everywhere. You can't hunt elephants alone. You can't maintain fire alone. You can't survive winter alone. Social living wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Neanderthals inherited this social structure and refined it, but their groups were small. Genetic evidence suggests bands of 10 to 20 individuals, maybe 30 in resource-rich areas. Nothing like the large groups that modern humans would eventually form. But small groups had advantages. Everyone knew everyone. Cooperation was intimate, personal. There was no anonymity. If someone didn't pull their weight, everyone knew. If someone made a discovery, everyone benefited. These small groups were probably extended families. Genetic studies of Neanderthal remains show that individuals in the same cave were often closely related. Fathers and daughters, siblings, cousins. This makes sense. In a world as dangerous as Pleistocene Europe, you couldn't trust strangers. You trusted family. Blood bonds were survival bonds, and they were learning. Every generation inherited not just genes but knowledge, how to make Levallois tools, where the good flint sources were, which caves were safe, which animals could be hunted and which were too dangerous, what plants were edible, when to migrate, and where. This accumulating cultural knowledge was just as important as their physical adaptations, maybe more important. By 300,000 years ago, the transformation was nearly complete. The creatures roaming Europe looked like Neanderthals. They had the body plan, they had the brain size, they had the tool technology, they had the social structures. Everything was in place. Everything except one thing. They were still part of the Carnivore Guild, not at the top of it. They were still competing with cave lions and hyenas and bears. They were still, at least sometimes, still prey. But they had the inheritance. They had the foundation. They had bodies built for power, brains capable of planning, hands that could craft sophisticated weapons, and social bonds that let them cooperate. They had everything they needed to make the leap from competitor to apex predator. They just needed time. They needed to put all these pieces together. They needed to learn how to use what they'd been given. And they would. Over the next couple 100,000 years, they would refine everything. They would perfect their hunting techniques. They would master fire. They would learn to coordinate attacks on prey that outweighed them by tons. They would learn to defend their kills from predators that had terrified their ancestors. They would learn, slowly and painfully and at great cost, how to be apex predators. But it all started here, with the inheritance, with the gifts passed down from Heidelbergensis, refined in the cold crucible of Ice Age Europe. Strong bodies, large brains, sophisticated tools, social bonds. These were the raw materials. This was the foundation. Everything that came after, every triumph and every adaptation, would build on this inheritance. Imagine for a moment that you could stand next to a Neanderthal, not some museum reconstruction, not some artist's interpretation, but the actual creature. You'd be struck immediately by how different they look from you, even though they're human. Even though they're your distant cousin, the differences aren't subtle, they're dramatic, and every single one of those differences tells a story about how they lived and how they survived. Start with the overall build. The average male Neanderthal stood about 5 feet 5 inches tall. Not short exactly, but not tall. Females averaged around 5 feet 1 inch. But height is misleading because Neanderthals were heavy, much heavier than a modern human of the same height. Males averaged about 172 pounds of solid muscle and bone, females around 146 pounds. And this wasn't soft weight, this wasn't fat, this was dense, compact power wrapped in thick bones and anchored by muscles that modern bodybuilders would envy. The body mass index, that measure doctors use to assess whether you're a healthy weight, would label Neanderthals as overweight, almost obese. Their BMI ranged from 26.9 to 28.3. But this is completely misleading, because BMI doesn't distinguish between fat and muscle. A modern NFL linebacker might have the same BMI as a Neanderthal, a heavyweight boxer, a professional rugby player. These are the only modern humans with comparable body compositions, and they achieve it through years of intensive training and careful nutrition. Neanderthals were born with it. The skeleton tells the story in detail. Neanderthal bones are thick, substantially thicker than modern human bones. When you look at a Neanderthal femur, the thigh bone, next to a modern human femur of the same length, the Neanderthal bone looks swollen. It's not diseased, It's just built to withstand enormous forces. The shaft is thicker. The ends are more robust. The attachment points for muscles are pronounced, sometimes dramatically so. These attachment points, called muscle insertion sites, are where tendons anchor muscle to bone. The size and prominence of these sites tell scientists how large and powerful the attached muscles were, and in Neanderthals these sites are massive. The deltoids, the shoulder muscles, attach to a ridge on the humerus that's twice as prominent as in modern humans. The biceps and triceps attach to sites that stick out from the bone like small shelves. The forearm muscles, responsible for grip strength, attach to bones that are twisted and thickened by the forces they had to withstand. Studies have tried to quantify just how strong Neanderthals were. It's difficult because you can't test a dead person's strength, but you can model it. You can measure the mechanical advantage of their joints, the leverage their muscles could apply, the forces their bones could withstand, and every study reaches the same conclusion. Neanderthals were extraordinarily strong. Upper body strength in particular was exceptional. Some estimates suggest Neanderthal upper body strength exceeded modern humans by 50 to 100%, maybe more. Think about what that means in practical terms. Imagine the strongest person you know, someone who can bench press 300 pounds. Now imagine someone 50% stronger. That's a Neanderthal, and that's not their trained maximum. That's their baseline. That's what they could do without ever lifting a weight or following a training program. Their bodies were naturally, effortlessly powerful in ways that modern humans can barely achieve with years of dedicated effort. But it's not just about being strong, it's about how that strength was used. The Neanderthal skeletal structure shows adaptations for specific types of movement, and those movements tell us exactly how they hunted and how they fought. Look at the shoulder complex. Neanderthal shoulder joints are positioned differently than ours. The shoulder socket faces more forward, giving greater range of motion for overhead thrusting movements. The clavicle, the collarbone, is thicker and more curved, providing better leverage for powerful downward strikes. The elbow and wrist show similar adaptations. The elbow joint allows for powerful pronation and supination, the twisting movements that let you rotate your forearm. This is crucial for wielding handheld weapons, for controlling a spear during a thrust, for maintaining grip on a struggling implement. The wrist bones are thick and tightly articulated, providing stability during impact. These aren't the wrists of someone who does delicate work with their hands all day. These are the wrists of someone who rams spears into mammoth ribs, and then there's the spine and trunk. This is where things get really interesting because recent research has revealed something remarkable about Neanderthal torso anatomy. Their ribcage wasn't shaped like ours. We have a barrel-shaped thorax, roughly cylindrical, optimized for the steady breathing needed for endurance activities like running. Neanderthals had what's called a bell-shaped thorax, narrower at the top, wider at the bottom, and this shape had profound implications for how their bodies worked. The bell-shaped ribcage provided more room at the bottom of the chest cavity. This meant a larger diaphragm, the muscle that powers breathing. A larger diaphragm means more air volume per breath, more oxygen intake, more capacity for explosive exertion. It's the respiratory equivalent of having a bigger engine, and Neanderthals needed it because their hunting strategy demanded rapid, intense bursts of maximum effort. Studies have modelled Neanderthal respiratory capacity using 3D reconstructions of their rib cages. The most detailed work used a nearly complete skeleton called Kibara 2, found in Israel. By reconstructing the ribcage digitally and measuring its volume, researchers could estimate lung capacity and diaphragmatic action. The results were striking. Neanderthal respiratory capacity was significantly larger than modern humans of comparable size. Their ability to intake and process oxygen during explosive activity was exceptional. This matters because oxygen is the limiting factor in athletic performance. When you sprint, when you lift something heavy, when you fight or flee, your muscles need oxygen immediately. The faster you can deliver oxygen to working muscles, the more power those muscles can generate. Neanderthals could flood their muscles with oxygen during brief, intense efforts. This gave them explosive strength, the ability to generate maximum force in seconds, then recover quickly for another burst. But this came at a cost. The same adaptations that made them powerful sprinters made them poor distance runners. The thick bones, the heavy musculature, the metabolically expensive fast-twitch muscle fibers. These all work against endurance. Neanderthals couldn't run marathons. They probably couldn't even jog for more than a few miles without exhausting themselves. Their bodies simply weren't designed for it. and we have genetic confirmation of this. When scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, they looked specifically at genes associated with athletic performance. Modern humans have been studied extensively for these genes. We know which variants correlate with endurance athletes, marathon runners and cyclists. We know which variants correlate with power athletes, sprinters and weightlifters. And when researchers checked the Neanderthal genome for these variants, they found something definitive. Neanderthals had more variants associated with power and sprint performance than with endurance performance. This isn't subtle. This is a clear genetic signal that Neanderthal bodies were optimized for explosive power, not sustained effort. Their muscles had more fast-twitch fibers, the type that generate tremendous force but fatigue quickly. They had metabolic adaptations that favored anaerobic energy production, the kind that powers sprints and heavy lifts. Everything about their genetics pointed in the same direction. Power, speed, explosion, not endurance, not marathons, not persistence. The leg structure reinforces this picture. Neanderthal legs were shorter than ours in proportion to their body size. Short legs mean less distance to move during each stride. That's a disadvantage for distance running where efficiency matters, but it's an advantage for acceleration and for generating power. Short legs mean your muscles have better mechanical advantage. You can generate more force with less effort. You can accelerate faster. You can jump higher. You can change direction more explosively. The femur, the thigh bone, shows another adaptation. In many Neanderthal specimens, the femur has a subtle forward curve. Scientists initially thought this might be pathological, some kind of disease or deformity. But it's too consistent across populations. It appears in healthy individuals. It's not a disease. It's an adaptation. That curve is a response to stress from massive calf muscles and quadriceps pulling on the bone. The bone remodeled itself to handle forces that would snap a modern human femur like a twig. And the feet. Neanderthal feet were broad and flat. Not the high-arched feet that modern humans have, which act like springs to improve running efficiency. Broad, stable platforms optimized for power generation, for explosive movements from a standing position, for maintaining balance while wielding heavy weapons, for pushing off during a sprint or a jump. These were the feet of someone who needed stability and power, not endurance and efficiency. The pelvis completes the picture. Neanderthal hips were wider than ours, giving them a lower center of gravity. This improved stability during close combat, made them harder to knock down or unbalance, gave them a more solid platform for generating rotational force in the trunk. Wide hips also meant a different gait pattern, less efficient for distance running, but more stable for moving through rough terrain or during violent physical confrontations. Every part of the Neanderthal body tells the same story. These were ambush predators, power hunters, creatures who stalked through forests, moving quietly until they were close to prey, then exploding into violent action. They didn't chase animals for miles across open plains. They got close, incredibly close, and then they struck with devastating force. The kind of force that could drive a stone-tipped spear through thick hide and into vital organs. The kind of force that could kill a 1,000-pound animal with a single blow. But this strategy was dangerous, extremely dangerous. When you hunt at close range, when you're within striking distance of your prey, you're also within striking distance of injury or death. A mammoth could gore you with its tusks. A bison could trample you. A bear could tear you apart. Close-range hunting required not just strength, but courage. It required the ability to face down an animal that outweighed you by tons and not flinch, not hesitate, not break and run. The fossil record shows the cost of this strategy. Neanderthal bones are covered in injuries, healed fractures on the arms and hands, the kind you get from blocking or deflecting attacks, broken ribs from being thrown or trampled, skull fractures from glancing blows that should have been fatal but somehow weren't, crushed vertebrae from impacts that left individuals partially paralyzed but still alive, still cared for by their group. Studies comparing Neanderthal trauma patterns to modern populations find the closest match with professional rodeo riders, people who regularly get thrown from or trampled by large animals, people who put themselves in harm's way as a profession and accumulate injuries accordingly. The comparison is telling. Neanderthals lived their entire lives engaging in activities that modern humans consider so dangerous we made them into entertainment for spectators. And yet, they survived. They healed from injuries that would kill or cripple modern humans. They continued hunting even with broken bones and missing teeth. The fossil record contains individuals who survived for years after catastrophic injuries. One individual from Shanidar Cave in Iraq had a crushed left orbit that probably left him blind in one eye. His right arm was withered, possibly from birth or from an injury. He had healed fractures on his ribs and legs, and yet he lived to be around 40 years old. Someone cared for him. Someone helped him. Someone kept him alive despite disabilities that should have meant death. This tells us something crucial. Neanderthal bodies weren't just powerful. They were resilient. They healed. They adapted. They could take punishment that would kill, softer creatures and keep going. Part of this was genetics. Part was lifestyle. Constant activity, constant physical stress, kept their bones dense and their muscles strong. But part of it was necessity. In a world as dangerous as Pleistocene Europe, you either healed tough or you died. The skull structure shows one final adaptation worth noting. Neanderthal faces projected forward, giving them a prognathic profile. This wasn't random. That forward-projecting face created a larger nasal cavity. Those huge nasal passages did more than warm and humidify cold air. They provided space for a more developed sense of smell. Neanderthals probably had a better sense of smell than modern humans. Not as good as a dog or a bear, but better than us. And in a world where detecting predators or prey could mean life or death, better olfaction was a significant advantage. The eyes tell another story. Neanderthal eye sockets were large, larger than ours. This suggests larger eyeballs, which means better vision, particularly in low-light conditions. They were probably adapted for crepuscular hunting, active at dawn and dusk when light levels are low but not completely dark. This makes sense for ambush predators. You want to see your prey, but you want to use shadows and dim light to conceal your approach. Large eyes would have given them an edge in these conditions. Everything fits together: the powerful build, the explosive musculature, the adaptations for close-range violence, the resilience and healing capacity, the enhanced senses. This wasn't just one adaptation. This was an entire suite of features working together to create something unprecedented. A hominin that could go toe-to-toe with the megafauna of the Pleistocene and win. A creature that could face down predators that had dominated Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and not just survive but compete. But bodies alone don't make an apex predator. You need more than muscle and bone. You need weapons. You need technique. You need the intelligence to plan and coordinate. You need the social bonds to work together. Neanderthals had all of these things. But the bodies came first. The bodies were the foundation. Without these remarkable, powerful, resilient bodies, nothing else would have mattered. They would have remained prey, no matter how smart they were, no matter how good their tools became. But they did have these bodies. Bodies built for battle. Bodies that could withstand the rigors of close combat hunting. Bodies that could generate the forces needed to kill animals that outweighed them by tons. Bodies that could heal from injuries that should have been fatal. Bodies that gave them the physical capacity to become what they needed to be. Apex predators. The top of the food chain. The hunters instead of the hunted. And with these bodies they were ready to take the next step, to develop the weapons and techniques that would let them put their physical advantages to use, to learn the deadly art of predation. A powerful body is meaningless without a weapon. Lions have claws and teeth. Bears have crushing jaws. Hyenas have bone-cracking molars. But Neanderthals, for all their strength, had none of these. Their hands were remarkable tools, capable of fine manipulation and tremendous grip strength. But human hands can't pierce thick hide. Human teeth can't tear through fur and muscle. To become predators, Neanderthals needed something external. They needed tools, they needed weapons, and they needed to make them better than anyone had ever made them before. The story of Neanderthal weapons begins around 400,000 years ago with something simple: wood, just wood. Not shaped stone yet, not sophisticated points or blades. Just carefully selected wooden spears, hardened in fire, sharpened to a point. The earliest evidence comes from a site called Schöningen in Germany, where archaeologists found something extraordinary preserved in an ancient lake bed. Spears, multiple spears, wooden shafts up to 2.3 meters long, carved from spruce trees, perfectly balanced for throwing or thrusting. These weren't simple sticks, they were engineered. Each spear had been carved so that the thickest, heaviest part was about a third of the way from the pointed end. This is the same balance point you'd find in a modern javelin. It maximizes stability and flight and penetrating power on impact. Someone understood projectile physics 400,000 years ago. Someone was thinking about how to make wood fly straight and hit hard. Someone was already a weapon maker, but wooden spears had limitations. Wood dulls, wood breaks. Wood can't penetrate thick hide without tremendous force behind it. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthal ancestors made do with wooden weapons because that's what they had. But around 300,000 years ago, something changed. Someone figured out how to make stonework as a weapon point, and that changed everything. The breakthrough was the Levallois technique. We talked about it before, this sophisticated method of preparing a stone core and then striking off flakes that are already the right shape. But understanding the technique intellectually is different from understanding what it meant practically. What it meant for hunting, what it meant for survival. Imagine you're a Neanderthal toolmaker. You found a good piece of flint the size of your fist or larger. You could just smash it and use whatever flakes come off. That's what earlier hominins did, but you know a better way. You turn the stone in your hands, examining it, feeling for flaws, visualizing the flake inside that you want to extract. You see it in your mind, the perfect point, before it exists in reality. You begin preparing the core. Small strikes around the edge, each one carefully placed to create a domed upper surface. You're shaping the negative space, the area that will become the striking platform. This takes time. Dozens of small flakes removed, each one contributing to the final geometry. One wrong strike and you have to start over. The stone could shatter, the core could crack, but you're patient, you're skilled. You've done this hundreds of times. Finally, the core is ready. The upper surface is domed like a turtle shell. The striking platform is prepared, flat and smooth. You position a hammerstone, maybe made of quartzite or a piece of antler. You aim for a specific spot on the platform. You can't rush this. The angle has to be perfect. The force has to be exactly right. Too soft and nothing happens. Too hard and the core shatters. You strike. The sound is sharp, distinctive, and from the core comes a flake, large and thin and perfect. It's already roughly the shape you need. Oval, pointed at one end. The right thickness. The edges are sharp enough to cut skin. Now you just need to retouch it, carefully removing tiny flakes to refine the shape and sharpen the point. A dozen precise strikes and you have a weapon point. Something that can punch through hide and muscle and bone. This is what archaeologists call a Levallois point, and Neanderthals made them by the thousands. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, these distinctive stone points appear in vast quantities. Some sites have hundreds of them, others have thousands. They became the signature Neanderthal tool, the weapon point that defined their hunting culture for over 200,000 years. But making the point was only half the battle. You had to attach it to something. Hafting, the process of fixing a stone point to a wooden shaft, required additional skills and materials. You needed cordage, something to bind the point to the shaft. You needed adhesive, something to hold it in place. And you needed to understand stress and leverage, how forces would act on the weapon during use. Evidence for Neanderthal hafting technology comes from multiple lines of evidence. Some stone points show impact fractures that could only occur if they were mounted on a shaft. The fracture patterns match experiments where modern researchers mount stone points on spears and thrust them into animal carcasses. Other evidence comes from residue analysis. Microscopic examination of stone tools has found traces of birch bark tar, a natural adhesive that Neanderthals extracted by heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen. This is complex chemistry. You have to maintain specific temperatures for extended periods. Get it wrong and you get nothing usable. Get it right and you have a sticky, waterproof adhesive perfect for hafting. The sophistication of this technology can't be overstated. Making birch bark tar requires maintaining temperatures between 340 and 400 degrees Celsius for several hours. You can't just throw bark in a fire and hope for the best. You need to create a sealed environment, probably by burying bark in a pit covered with earth and building a fire on top. The bark heats, but doesn't burn. The tar oozes out. You collect it. You use it immediately while it's still, warm and pliable, or you store it for later use. This is planned, multi-step technology requiring specialized knowledge passed down through generations. It's not intuitive. You can't figure it out by accident. Someone had to experiment, had to fail repeatedly, had to eventually succeed and then teach others. This is cumulative culture. Knowledge building on knowledge, innovation preserved and transmitted, and Neanderthals had it. Around 120,000 years ago, we get our first direct evidence that Neanderthal spears were actually used for hunting and not just scavenging or defense. The evidence comes from a site called Neumark Nord in Germany. Archaeologists there found bones from straight-tusked elephants, massive creatures that stood over 4 meters tall and weighed up to 10 tons. Mixed with the elephant bones were stone tools and something else, deer bones. Specifically, 2 deer vertebrae with unusual holes in them. Microscopic analysis of those holes revealed something remarkable. They were impact fractures. Something had punched through the bone with tremendous force, creating a distinctive cone-shaped break. And the size and shape of those fractures matched exactly what you'd expect from a stone-tipped spear thrust with enough force to penetrate deep into a deer's body. These weren't cut marks from butchering. These weren't scavenger tooth marks. These were weapon impacts. Proof positive that Neanderthals were using spears to hunt, probably to kill 120,000 years ago. But were they thrusting spears, used at arm's length, or throwing spears used from a distance? This question has generated enormous debate among archaeologists. The balance of evidence suggests primarily thrusting. Neanderthal spears don't show the design features you'd expect in specialized throwing spears. They're heavier. The stone points are larger and more robust than you'd want for a projectile. The shaft proportions suggest weapons designed to be gripped firmly and driven into prey from close range. This matches perfectly with what we know about Neanderthal bodies. They had the upper body strength to drive a spear with devastating force. Their shoulder structure was optimized for overhead or underhand thrusting motions. Their entire hunting strategy was built around getting close to prey and delivering a killing blow at arm's reach or less. They weren't throwing weapons from 30 meters away. They were ramming spears into ribs from 3 meters or less. This is incredibly dangerous hunting. Your margin for error is 0. If you miss, if your spear doesn't penetrate deep enough, you're standing next to an enraged, injured animal that can easily kill you. This is why Neanderthal fossils show so many traumatic injuries. This is why their hunting strategy demanded not just strength, but extraordinary courage and coordination. But stone-tipped spears weren't their only weapons. The Mousterian toolkit, the collection of stone tools that Neanderthals made and used, included dozens of different tool types: scrapers for processing hides, blades for cutting meat, denticulated tools with serrated edges, possibly for sawing wood or bone. Each tool type served a specific function. Each required specific skills to make, and all of them together represent a material culture far more complex than anything earlier hominins had achieved. Some Mousterian tools are tiny, so small they're called microliths. These small points show exceptionally fine retouching, careful shaping with precise strikes that removed flakes just a few millimeters wide. Studies suggest these small points might have taken advantage of Neanderthal grip strength. Modern humans trying to make these tools struggle because they're difficult to hold and shape without crushing them. But Neanderthals with their powerful hands and fine motor control could apply exactly the right amount of force. These tools weren't just functional, they were in some sense signature Neanderthal artifacts, possible only because of their unique combination of strength and dexterity. And they were constantly innovating. The archaeological record shows regional variations in tool styles. Neanderthals in southwestern France made different tools than Neanderthals in Germany or the Middle East. This regional diversity suggests distinct cultural traditions, groups developing their own approaches to tool-making and passing them down through generations. This is culture, real recognizable culture with local traditions and innovations. But weapons are only as good as the raw materials you make them from. Flint and chert, the stones Neanderthals preferred, aren't found everywhere. Good quality flint sources were valuable, contested resources, and Neanderthals knew where they were. Studies of stone tools at Neanderthal sites show that most raw materials were sourced locally within 5 kilometers of the site. This suggests small territories, groups that stayed within familiar ranges. But not all materials were local. Some sites contained stone tools made from flint that came from 30, 50, even 100 kilometers away. These exotic materials tell us that Neanderthals either traveled long distances themselves or had some form of trade or exchange with neighboring groups. Either way, it suggests knowledge of the landscape far beyond immediate surroundings. Mental maps encompassing hundreds of square kilometers, an understanding of where to find resources and how to get them. The weapons themselves provide another window into Neanderthal cognition. Making a levallois point requires holding in your mind a 3-dimensional image of something that doesn't exist yet. It requires planning a sequence of actions, each dependent on the previous one succeeding. It requires the ability to recognize mistakes early and correct them or start over. These are executive functions, higher-order cognitive processes that require a sophisticated brain. Some researchers argue that language was necessary to teach these techniques effectively. Could you learn Levallois napping without verbal instruction? Maybe, through years of observation and trial and error. But with language, with the ability to say, strike here, not there, or you need to prepare the platform first, learning becomes dramatically faster and more reliable. The complexity of Neanderthal tool technology suggests they had language. Maybe not as elaborate as modern human language, but something. Communication beyond gesture and demonstration. And they were teaching. Sites with evidence of tool manufacturing often contain mistakes. Flakes struck at the wrong angle, cores that broke during preparation, unfinished tools abandoned when errors couldn't be corrected. These mistakes suggest novices learning the craft. Young Neanderthals watching the adults and trying to replicate their skills. Making errors. Learning from them. This is cultural transmission. Knowledge passing from expert to novice, from generation to generation. By about 80,000 years ago, Neanderthal weapon technology had reached its peak. They were making perfectly balanced spears with stone points hafted, using sophisticated adhesives. They were producing dozens of specialized tool types, each crafted for specific tasks. They were sourcing raw materials from diverse locations across their territories. They were teaching their young the intricate skills needed to survive. And they were using these weapons to hunt successfully. Not just small game, not just scavenging. They were taking down prime adult animals, the strongest and most dangerous prey in their environment. The weapons made them hunters. But more than that, the weapons made them credible threats to other predators. A Neanderthal with a spear wasn't helpless against a cave lion. They weren't guaranteed prey for a bear. They could fight back. They could defend themselves. They could sometimes win. And every time they won, every time they drove off a predator or defended a kill or survived an attack, they became a little more formidable, a little less like prey, a little more like the apex predators they were becoming. But weapons alone weren't enough. You could have the best spears in the world and still freeze to death on a winter night. You could hunt successfully and still lose your kill to hyenas. You could defend yourself from predators and still get driven out of the best hunting grounds by competitors. To truly become apex predators, Neanderthals needed more than just weapons. They needed control over their environment. They needed fire and shelter. They needed territory that was defensibly theirs. They needed to transform from nomads constantly fleeing danger into residents who could stand their ground. And they were about to do exactly that. There's something primal about fire. Something that separates those who control it from those who fear it. In the Pleistocene, fire was the dividing line between being just another animal and being something more. Something that could reshape the environment instead of just surviving in it. And Neanderthals crossed that line, not just by using fire when they found it, but by controlling it, by making it do what they wanted, by turning it into the most powerful tool they would ever possess. The evidence for Neanderthal fire use goes back at least 400,000 years, maybe longer. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, archaeologists find hearths, concentrations of ash and charcoal, fire-cracked rocks that were heated and cooled repeatedly, burnt bone fragments, all the signatures of controlled, sustained fire use. But there's a difference between using fire and making fire, between taking advantage of a wildfire and being able to start one whenever you need it. For a long time, scientists weren't sure if Neanderthals could actually start fires, or if they just maintained flames scavenged from natural sources. Lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous combustion in peat bogs. Natural fires happen. They would have happened regularly in the Pleistocene. And once you have fire, keeping it alive is relatively simple. Add fuel, protect it from wind and rain, carry embers from one campsite to the next. You could survive for generations without ever starting a fire from scratch. But recent evidence suggests Neanderthals could do more. They could create fire. At several sites in France, archaeologists found chunks of pyrite with distinctive scratch marks. Pyrite is iron sulfide, and when you strike it against flint, it creates sparks, hot sparks, sparks that can ignite tinder if you know what you're doing. The scratch marks on these pyrite chunks suggest they were struck repeatedly, deliberately. Someone was making sparks, someone was starting fires, and there's another line of evidence: manganese dioxide, black mineral chunks that appear at Neanderthal sites in surprising quantities. One site alone, Pech-de-Lazay in France, yielded over 500 fragments of manganese dioxide. About half show clear signs of being scraped or ground down. Why? What were they using it for? Manganese dioxide lowers the combustion temperature of wood. If you mix powdered manganese dioxide with your tinder, wood that might ignite at 300 degrees Celsius will ignite at 250 degrees. That makes fire starting easier, more reliable, more likely to succeed even in damp conditions. This is chemistry. Advanced chemistry. Someone had to discover that this specific black rock made fire starting easier. Someone had to experiment, fail, succeed, remember, and teach others. This is applied science from 250,000 years ago. And it meant Neanderthals weren't dependent on finding fire. They could make it, on demand, whenever they needed it. And they needed it constantly. Not just for warmth, though that was critical. Not just for cooking, though that helped. They needed fire because fire was their most powerful weapon against the carnivores that threatened them. Because here's what no other predator had. Every apex carnivore in Pleistocene Europe, every cave lion and cave hyena and cave bear, they all feared fire. Instinctively. Completely. Fire meant danger. Fire meant pain. Fire meant death. And Neanderthals could create it at will. Imagine you're approaching a cave. Your group needs shelter. Winter is coming. This cave has everything you need. Deep galleries for protection from the elements. Multiple chambers for different activities. A defensible entrance. But there's a problem. Cave bears are already here. You can smell them. See the claw marks on the walls. Hear them moving in the darkness. Normally this would mean finding another cave. Normally the bears would win by default because confronting them directly would be suicide. But you have fire. Your group gathers at the entrance. You build up the flames until they're roaring, crackling, sending up clouds of smoke. The bears in the back of the cave smell it. They hear it. They panic. Because bears, for all their size and power, are terrified of fire. They flee. They find another exit, or they charge past your group, staying as far from the flames as possible. And just like that, the cave is yours. Not through combat, not through force, through controlled use of something the bears can't comprehend and can't fight. This wasn't theoretical. This happened. We know it happened because we find evidence of both Neanderthals and cave bears using the same caves, but at different times. The stratigraphy shows layers of bear remains, then layers of Neanderthal occupation, then bear remains again. They were taking turns, competing for the same prime real estate, and fire was the tool that let Neanderthals compete successfully. But fire did more than displace competitors. It transformed caves into actual homes. Without fire, a cave is just a hole in the ground. Cold, damp, dark, dangerous. With fire, a cave becomes something else entirely. The flames provide light, extending the useful day beyond sunset. They provide warmth, making even deep caves habitable through winter. They provide a way to cook food, making tough meat more digestible and killing parasites that cause disease. And crucially, they provide security. At sites across Europe, archaeologists find hearth features that show sophisticated use of fire. At a brick Romany in Spain, researchers found evidence of 8 evenly spaced hearths lined up along one wall of a rock shelter. Each hearth was about 2 meters from the next. Each showed signs of repeated use over extended periods. The spacing wasn't random. 8 hearths meant 8 sleeping areas, 1 person on each side of each fire. This was planned, organized. Someone thought about how many people needed shelter and arranged the fires accordingly. The positioning was defensive too. Fires near cave entrances would deter any predator thinking about entering. The light would eliminate the darkness that predators relied on for ambush. The smoke would mark the cave as occupied, from a distance, warning off competitors before they even approached. Fire turned caves from vulnerable holes into defensible strongholds, and Neanderthals used fire for more than just heat and light. Evidence suggests they used it for processing materials. Wooden spears could be hardened in flames, making the points more durable. Animal hides could be smoked to preserve them and make them more supple for clothing. Birch bark tar required careful application of heat to produce. Stone could be heat-treated to improve its flaking properties, making it easier to shape into tools. Fire was a multi-purpose technology, useful for dozens of different applications. But controlling fire meant more than just using it. It meant managing it, keeping it at the right intensity, preventing it from spreading, gathering enough fuel to maintain it for days or weeks. This required planning and cooperation. Someone had to be responsible for the fire. Someone had to gather wood. Someone had to keep watch to ensure it didn't go out or burn out of control. Fire created new social roles, new forms of cooperation that earlier hominins hadn't needed. The strategic use of caves shows similar sophistication. Neanderthals didn't just grab the first cave they found, they selected carefully. Good caves had multiple desirable features, defensible entrances that could be guarded easily, multiple chambers for different activities, proximity to water sources, access to hunting grounds, good views of the surrounding landscape so you could see danger approaching. Finding caves with all these features required knowledge of the territory, experience, memory of which caves were best and why. Archaeological evidence shows Neanderthals returned to the same caves repeatedly over generations. At some sites, layers of occupation stack up like pages in a book. Each layer represents a visit. Each visit might have lasted weeks or months. Then the group moved on, following game or avoiding bad weather or exploring new territories. But they came back. The same families, or descendants of those families, returning to caves their ancestors had used. This is the beginning of the concept of territory. This place is ours. We've been here before. We'll be here again. And they defended those territories. Not just from other species, but from other Neanderthals. Resources were limited. Good caves were rare. Prime hunting grounds could only support so many predators. When two Neanderthal groups encountered each other, the outcome depended on many factors. Were they related? Could they cooperate? Or were they strangers competing for the same resources? The evidence suggests both scenarios occurred. Some sites show evidence of peaceful interaction, trade of raw materials, maybe intermarriage. Other sites show evidence of violence, healed injuries from weapons, bones with cut marks suggesting cannibalism during times of extreme food shortage. The relationship with predators was equally complex. Cave lions, cave hyenas, wolves, and Neanderthals all needed the same things: prey animals, water, shelter, and there weren't enough resources for everyone, so they competed. But the nature of that competition was changing. Early on, Neanderthals were clearly subordinate. They got access to resources only after the more dangerous predators had taken what they wanted. But as Neanderthals became more sophisticated, more organized, more capable, that dynamic shifted. Evidence from several caves shows something remarkable: Neanderthals hunting the predators. At Grotte de Spey in Belgium, archaeologists found remains of wolves, cave lions, and cave bears, mixed with stone tools and evidence of butchery. The predators weren't brought there by other predators. They were brought by Neanderthals, hunted, killed, processed for their hides, and maybe their meat. This is role reversal, the hunted becoming the hunters, the prey killing the predators. And they were using those predator parts for something specific. At several sites, researchers found cave lion claws with cut marks, evidence they'd been deliberately removed from paws. These weren't food processing marks. These were marks from someone carefully extracting claws, probably for use as ornaments or tools. At Einhornhöhle Cave in Germany, a cave lion toe bone showed cut marks consistent with removing the entire pelt with claws attached. Someone skinned a cave lion, someone took its hide, probably to wear or display. This is deeply symbolic. Taking the skin of your enemy, wearing the claws of a predator that once hunted your ancestors. It's a statement, a declaration of dominance. We're not afraid of you anymore. We can kill you. We can wear your skin. This shows up in human cultures around the world, using predator symbols to demonstrate power and courage. Neanderthals were doing it 50,000 years ago or more. The pattern repeats with cave bears. Bare teeth and bones appear at Neanderthal sites, sometimes with evidence of modification. Teeth with grooves cut into them, probably for suspension as pendants. Bare bones broken in ways consistent with marrow extraction. These weren't just scavenged remains, these were trophies, proof of successful hunts, evidence that Neanderthals were actively targeting creatures that had once been their nightmares. But this didn't mean predators stopped being dangerous. The fossil record makes clear that attacks continued throughout Neanderthal history. That 74% rate of predator trauma didn't go away. What changed was the balance. Earlier, Neanderthals were attacked and usually lost. Later, Neanderthals were attacked and sometimes won. The predators were still dangerous. The wilderness was still lethal. But Neanderthals were holding their own. Cave hyenas remained particularly problematic because they adapted in ways other predators didn't. Hyenas are intelligent, social, capable of learning and adjusting strategies. When Neanderthals started using fire to control caves, hyenas started raiding campsites at night. When Neanderthals defended their kills, hyenas started following hunting parties, waiting for opportunities to steal. The two species engaged in what scientists call niche differentiation. They hunted similar prey but specialized in different aspects. Neanderthals preferred prime deer and reindeer. Hyenas focused more on horses and cattle. This reduced direct competition but didn't eliminate it. Wolves presented a different challenge because they hunted in packs with sophisticated coordination. A lone Neanderthal was vulnerable to wolf packs. Even groups had to be cautious. But Neanderthals learned to use that pack structure against them. By targeting alpha individuals or denning sites, they could disrupt entire packs. The evidence suggests uneasy coexistence. Wolves and Neanderthals sharing landscapes but avoiding direct confrontation when possible. By about 100,000 years ago, the transformation was largely complete. Neanderthals controlled fire reliably. They selected and defended choice caves. They returned to the same locations repeatedly, establishing territories. They actively hunted predators that had once hunted them. They were no longer competing for scraps at the bottom of the carnivore guild. They were legitimate members, holding their own against species that had dominated Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. But they weren't at the top yet. Cave lions still ruled the open steppes. Cave hyenas still controlled many prime hunting grounds. Bears still claimed the best caves. Neanderthals had achieved equality with the carnivores, but not dominance. Not yet. They had fire and shelter and weapons, they had the tools. But to truly become apex predators, they needed to put everything together. They needed to combine their physical power, their weapons technology, and their fire control into a coordinated strategy. They needed to learn to hunt not just for survival, but for dominance, and they were about to do exactly that. The Pleistocene was never peaceful, but between about 200,000 and 40,000 years ago, something changed in the European wilderness. The ancient balance, the hierarchy that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, began to break down. The carnivore guild, that deadly alliance of predators that had ruled the continent, was fracturing, and Neanderthals were the reason why. A carnivore guild is an ecological concept. It describes all the meat-eating species in an area that compete for the same prey. In Africa today, you have lions, leopards, cheetahs, hyenas, wild dogs, all hunting similar animals. They compete directly, stealing kills from each other, sometimes killing each other over territory or food. There's a hierarchy. Lions generally dominate. Hyenas come next. Leopards avoid direct confrontation. Wild dogs hunt at different times to avoid competition. In Pleistocene Europe, the guild was even more crowded and far more dangerous. Cave lions at the top, massive and powerful. Cave hyenas as the bone crushers and endurance predators. Leopards in forested areas. Wolves running in packs. Bears claiming caves and fishing spots. And now Neanderthals, moving up through the ranks, challenging species that had never been challenged before. The dynamics of this competition are written in the archaeological record, but you have to know how to read it. When scientists excavate a cave, they don't just look at what's there, they look at how it got there. Bones tell stories. Cut marks from stone tools tell you about butchery. Tooth marks tell you about scavengers. The types of bones present tell you about who got first access to a kill. The age and sex of prey animals tell you about hunting strategies. And what the evidence shows is fascinating. Neanderthals and cave hyenas were hunting in the same territories, going after the same species, sometimes at the same sites. But they were hunting differently, strategically differently, in a way that suggests they were actively trying to avoid direct conflict while still competing for resources. Scientists call this niche differentiation, finding ways to reduce overlap even when you're after the same basic resources. Look at the prey remains from Neanderthal sites versus hyena den sites. Both groups were hunting deer, horses, and cattle, the big herbivores that dominated Pleistocene grasslands. But when you break down which specific animals they were targeting, a pattern emerges. Neanderthals overwhelmingly preferred deer, particularly red deer and reindeer. Their sites show these species in much higher proportions than you'd expect based on what was available in the environment. Cave hyenas, meanwhile, preferred horses and cattle. Their dens are packed with horse remains, far more than deer. This isn't random. This is deliberate specialization. Both species learning, over thousands of years of competition, how to reduce direct conflict by focusing on slightly different prey. Not different enough to eliminate competition, but different enough that they weren't constantly fighting over the exact same kills. But there's another distinction, and this one is crucial. Neanderthals preferentially hunted prime adults, healthy, mature animals in their physical peak. This is counterintuitive. Prime adults are harder to kill. They're faster, stronger, more dangerous. Most predators target the young, the old, the sick, the easy prey. But Neanderthals weren't most predators. They had weapons. They had coordination. They had strategies that let them take down animals in their prime, animals that would defeat a lone predator. Cave hyenas followed the more typical pattern. Their dens show higher proportions of juvenile and elderly prey. They were targeting vulnerable animals, using their numbers and endurance to wear down prey that couldn't fight back effectively. This is the standard predator approach. It works, it's safe, it's efficient. But it's also what every other predator was doing, which meant maximum competition. By focusing on prime adults, Neanderthals were doing something radical. They were accessing a food source that most predators couldn't reach. A prime adult deer represented days of food for a small band. A prime adult horse could feed a group for a week. These weren't just meals, these were jackpots. And by specializing in hunting them, Neanderthals carved out a niche that reduced competition with hyenas while maximizing caloric return. But specialization didn't mean avoiding conflict, it meant changing the nature of the conflict. Because here's what happened when a Neanderthal band successfully brought down a prime adult deer. The smell of blood attracted every carnivore within miles. Within minutes you'd have hyenas approaching, maybe wolves, possibly a cave lion if you were unlucky, and you'd have seconds to decide, defend the kill or abandon it. Evidence suggests Neanderthals chose defense more often than flight. At multiple sites, researchers find evidence of what they call defended kills. These are prey animals that were partially butchered on site, with stone tools scattered around and clear evidence of rapid, efficient processing. The bones show systematic dismemberment, the best cuts removed quickly, and then abandonment, usually with substantial meat still on the carcass. This pattern suggests a specific strategy. Kill the animal. Begin processing immediately. Take the best parts, the tenderloin, the organs, the fat-rich tissues, bundle them up, and then leave before the competition arrives in force. It's not ideal. You're leaving food behind. But it's safer than trying to defend an entire carcass against multiple predators. You get the best cuts and survive to hunt again. But sometimes Neanderthals didn't leave. Sometimes they stood their ground. And the evidence for this is written in predator bones. At Grotte de Spy in Belgium, the cave that Neanderthals occupied repeatedly for thousands of years, archaeologists found something unusual mixed with the prey animal bones. Wolf bones, cave lion bones, cave bear bones. And they weren't just random accumulations. They showed cut marks, evidence of skinning and butchering. This means Neanderthals weren't just defending against these predators, they were hunting them, actively targeting them, and this represents something profound. When you hunt predators, when you kill the species that have been hunting you, you're making a statement. You're declaring yourself their equal or better. You're saying this landscape belongs to us as much as it belongs to you. The logistics of hunting cave lions are staggering. A male cave lion weighed up to 770 pounds. They had claws like butcher knives, jaws that could crush bone. They were built to kill. How do you hunt something like that? You don't do it alone. You don't do it on impulse. You plan. You coordinate. You use the advantages you have, intelligence and weapons and cooperation, against the advantages they have, size and strength and natural weapons. Evidence from Einhornhöhle Cave in Germany provides details. Researchers there found a cave lion toe bone with a very specific cut mark pattern. The mark was made by a stone tool carefully positioned to separate the skin from the bone without damaging the pelt. This was someone skinning a lion, removing the entire hide with claws attached. This takes skill. This takes practice. This takes prior experience butchering large carnivores. And it takes a specific kind of courage. Because even a dead lion is dangerous during processing. Those claws can still cut you. That skin is thick and tough, difficult to work with stone tools. The entire process would take hours, and you're exposed the whole time. You need people standing guard. You need lookouts watching for other predators. You need cooperation on a level that most predators never achieve. But Neanderthals were achieving it, and they were doing it not just with lions, but with the other apex predators they encountered. Cave bears provided thick, warm hides perfect for cold weather clothing. Wolves provided smaller pelts useful for hand coverings or trim. Even cave hyenas, as dangerous as they were, apparently became prey themselves in certain circumstances. The relationship with cave hyenas deserves special attention because it was the most complex and longest lasting of all the predator interactions. Hyenas are smart. Really smart. They learn, they adapt, they remember, and they have social structures as sophisticated as any predator on Earth. When Neanderthals started using new strategies, hyenas noticed. When Neanderthals defended kills, hyenas learned to wait them out. When Neanderthals set up base camps, hyenas learned to raid them at night. This created an escalating cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation. Neanderthals would develop a new strategy, hyenas would adapt, Neanderthals would counter-adapt, and on it went for tens of thousands of years. The archaeological record shows this arms race in fascinating detail. At sites from 200,000 years ago, you find lots of hyena scavenging of Neanderthal kills, bones with both stone tool cut marks and hyena tooth marks, showing that hyenas were getting access after Neanderthals had processed the kill. But at sites from 100,000 years ago, the pattern changes. You find fewer bones with hyena damage, more complete processing by Neanderthals, evidence of rapid, efficient butchery that removed all usable meat before scavengers arrived. Neanderthals had learned to work faster, to be more thorough, to deny hyenas the easy scavenging opportunities they'd once relied on. And in some cases, you find direct evidence of conflict. Hyena bones with trauma consistent with being struck by heavy objects or impaled by sharp implements. Neanderthal bones with hyena tooth marks, showing attacks did occur. These weren't casual encounters. These were violent confrontations over resources that both species desperately needed. The cave bear situation was different because the conflict was primarily about space, not food. Cave bears were mostly vegetarian, feeding on plants and roots. They weren't competing with Neanderthals for prey animals, but they needed the same caves for hibernation, and in Ice Age Europe, good caves were more valuable than any amount of meat. A cave could keep you alive through winter when exposure would kill you in hours. The evidence suggests a pattern of seasonal competition. During summer and fall, when cave bears were active and foraging, Neanderthals could occupy caves with less conflict. But in late autumn, when bears were seeking hibernation sites, competition intensified. Both species wanted deep, protected caves with stable temperatures. Both species would fight for them. At Sophie's Cave in Germany, researchers found evidence of this conflict in the form of cave bear bones, showing both carnivore damage and evidence of human modification. Some bear vertebrae had puncture marks from large carnivore canines, probably cave lions hunting bears. But other bones showed cut marks from stone tools, suggesting Neanderthals were also hunting bears, probably young ones or those separated from their mothers. The adult bears, though, were a different story. A fully grown cave bear could weigh 100 pounds. They were strong enough to break a human skull with a single swipe. Confronting them directly would be suicide, but Neanderthals had fire, and bears are instinctively deeply terrified of fire. The strategy was probably simple: build fires at cave entrances, create smoke, make noise, force the bears to choose between facing flames or finding another den. Most chose another den, but some didn't. Some stood their ground, and those confrontations left marks on both species. Neanderthal fossils show bear attack injuries, broken bones and puncture wounds consistent with Ursan predation. Cave bear fossils from caves also used by Neanderthals show unusual trauma patterns, injuries that don't match other bear injuries or predator attacks. These might represent defensive wounds from human weapons, bears injured while defending their territory. By about 50,000 years ago, the balance had shifted decisively. Neanderthals were no longer merely competing in the carnivore guild. They were dominating it in many regions. Cave lion populations were declining, possibly due to a combination of climate change and competition with humans. Cave bear populations were shrinking, confined to increasingly marginal territories. Wolf packs were learning to avoid Neanderthal hunting grounds. Even hyenas, those ultimate survivors, were feeling the pressure. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Genetic studies of cave bears show declining population diversity starting around 50,000 years ago, suggesting small, isolated populations under stress. Cave lion fossils become rarer and more geographically restricted. Wolf remains show changes in body size and morphology, possibly indicating dietary stress. The entire carnivore guild was being restructured around Neanderthal presence. This restructuring had cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. When top predators decline, prey populations change. When prey populations change, vegetation changes. Neanderthals weren't just participants in Pleistocene ecology, they were major drivers of it. Their hunting pressure on prime adult prey meant younger animals survived in higher proportions. Their territorial defense around caves forced other predators into suboptimal territories. Their use of fire altered vegetation patterns around long-term settlement sites. But dominance came with costs. The more successful Neanderthals became as predators, the more they were locked into that role. They needed huge amounts of meat to maintain their body mass and activity levels. They needed prime hunting territories. They needed caves and fire and weapons. They'd created a survival strategy that demanded constant success. Any disruption, any change in prey availability, any increase in competition could be catastrophic, and they were still suffering losses. The 74% rate of predator trauma continued even at the height of Neanderthal success. They were winning the carnivore guild wars, but they were paying a heavy price. Every hunt risked injury. Every territorial confrontation risked death. They were apex predators, but they were also the most vulnerable apex predators the world had ever seen. No thick hide, no natural weapons, no poison or venom, just intelligence, cooperation and stone-tipped spears. But those tools were enough. By 40,000 years ago, when modern humans first entered Europe in numbers, they found a landscape already dominated by Neanderthals. Not the hunted, not the prey, not the marginal competitors they'd been 400,000 years earlier. They found apex predators who had claimed the continent through force and fire, and unwavering determination. They found the victors of the carnivore guild wars. The Neanderthals had risen from prey to predator. They'd done it without evolving claws or fangs. They'd done it through innovation and adaptation, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept their place at the bottom of the food chain. And in doing so, they'd transformed themselves into something unprecedented. Something that would shape the landscape for thousands of years to come. Strength alone doesn't make an apex predator. Neither do weapons or fire or territorial control. Lions are strong, but a lone lion starves. Wolves have teeth, but a single wolf can't bring down a bison. What makes apex predators truly dangerous isn't individual capability, it's cooperation. The ability to work together, to coordinate, to share information and divide labour and achieve things no individual could accomplish alone. And Neanderthals, for all their physical power, understood this implicitly. The evidence for Neanderthal social structure comes from multiple sources, and each one reveals something crucial about how they lived and survived. Start with the genetics. In 2022, researchers published an extraordinary study of Neanderthal DNA from Chagirskaya Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. They'd recovered remains of 13 individuals, 11 from Chagirskaya Cave and 2 from nearby Okladnikov Cave. This might not sound remarkable until you understand what the DNA revealed. These 13 Neanderthals were related, closely related. The genetic analysis identified a father and his teenage daughter, a second-degree relationship, probably a young boy and his aunt or grandmother. Multiple individuals sharing rare genetic variants that only persist for a few generations. This wasn't a random collection of bodies accumulated over thousands of years. This was a family, a band, a group of people who lived together, hunted together, and apparently died together around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. But it's what the DNA didn't show that's equally revealing. These 13 individuals had extremely low genetic diversity, much lower than any modern human population, even isolated ones. Low genetic diversity means a small breeding population. The researchers calculated that this Neanderthal community consisted of only 10 to 20 individuals total, maybe 30 at most. This was their world. This was their society. A handful of people facing the Pleistocene together, and they weren't unusual. Genetic analysis of Neanderthals from other sites shows similar patterns. Low diversity, small population sizes, Groups of 10 to 30 individuals seems to have been the norm across Neanderthal range. For comparison, modern hunter-gatherer bands average around 30 to 60 people, with some reaching 100. Neanderthals lived in groups half that size or smaller. Small groups have advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are intimacy and efficiency. Everyone knows everyone. There's no anonymity. Cooperation is personal. If someone doesn't contribute, everyone notices. If someone makes a discovery, everyone benefits immediately. Decision-making is fast because you don't need complex hierarchies or voting systems. You just talk it out face to face. But small groups are also vulnerable. A single death is catastrophic. Lose your best hunter and the group might starve. Lose a woman of childbearing age and your population growth stalls. Lose a child and years of investment vanish. There's no redundancy, no backup. Every individual matters critically. And in a world as dangerous as Pleistocene Europe, where traumatic injury and early death were common, this vulnerability was constant. The genetic evidence reveals another crucial detail about Neanderthal social organization. The pattern of diversity in different parts of the genome tells scientists about who moved between groups. In the Chagaskaya cave family, mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only through mothers, showed much more diversity than Y chromosome DNA, which is inherited only through fathers. This means females were coming from outside the group while males were staying put. Anthropologists call this patrilocal residence. Women leave their birth groups to join their partners' groups. Men stay with their fathers, brothers, and male cousins. This creates a social structure where the male members of a band are closely related, forming a core that persists across generations, while females cycle in from neighbouring groups, bringing genetic diversity and social connections. This pattern appears in multiple Neanderthal populations, suggesting it was the standard social structure across their range, and it has profound implications. Patrilocal residence means male coalitions, brothers hunting together, defending territory together, backing each other in conflicts. These aren't temporary alliances between strangers. These are lifelong bonds between close relatives, the kind of bonds that let you coordinate complex, dangerous activities because you know exactly how your partners will react, and it means social networks. When females move between groups, they maintain connections to their birth families. A woman living with her partner's band still has brothers, cousins, uncles in her home band. She's a living link between groups. This creates opportunities for trade, for sharing information, for calling on allies during times of trouble. Small bands connected through female migration could access a much larger network when needed. Archaeological evidence supports these genetic findings. At La Roselle in France, researchers found something extraordinary: footprints. Hundreds of Neanderthal footprints preserved in what had been a sandy shore around 80,000 years ago. By measuring the size and spacing of these footprints, scientists could estimate the age and size of the individuals who made them. The results were surprising. The La Roselle footprints were made by a group of 10 to 13 individuals, perfectly matching the genetic estimates of band size. But the age composition was unusual. Most of the footprints were made by children and adolescents. Only 1 or 2 adult-sized footprints appeared in the assemblage. This snapshot of a moment 80,000 years ago shows us something important. Neanderthal bands included lots of young people. Children weren't rare or protected in some separate space. They were part of the group, moving with adults, learning by doing. This has implications for social learning and cultural transmission. If children were constantly with adults during daily activities, they were watching and learning continuously. Watching how to make tools, watching how to track animals, watching how to read weather signs and find water and select campsites. This kind of immersive observational learning is incredibly effective. You don't need formal teaching. You learn by being there, by participating, by gradually taking on more responsibility as you grow. But small bands faced an obvious problem. You can't hunt mammoths with 10 people. You can't defend a large territory with 15. You can't accumulate and transmit the full range of survival knowledge with only a handful of adults. So how did Neanderthals accomplish the things we know they accomplished? How did they coordinate large-scale hunts? How did they maintain sophisticated technologies? The answer appears to be aggregation. Temporary gatherings of multiple bands coming together for specific purposes. The evidence for this comes from several extraordinary sites where Neanderthals hunted megafauna in ways that required far more people than a single small band. Neumark Nord in Germany is the most spectacular example. This site, dating to around 125,000 years ago during a warm interglacial period, contains the remains of over 70 straight-tusked elephants. These weren't ordinary elephants. Paleoloxodon antiquus stood nearly 4 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed up to 10 tons. They were the largest land mammals in Pleistocene Europe, and they were extremely dangerous. A single elephant could kill a dozen people before going down. The elephants at Newmark Nord show clear evidence of systematic butchery. Stone tools scattered among the bones, cut marks on ribs and vertebrae, systematic dismemberment, and here's the crucial detail, the quantity of meat. A single straight-tusked elephant provided approximately 4 tons of edible tissue. That's 8,000 pounds of meat, fat, and organs. One elephant could feed 20 people for 2 weeks, or it could feed 100 people for 3 days, or 200 people for a day and a half. The math tells us something important. A band of 10 to 20 people doesn't need to kill an elephant. It's too much food. Most of it would spoil before they could consume it, but if you could gather multiple bands together, maybe 50 to 100 people total, suddenly an elephant hunt makes sense. Everyone eats well, everyone shares in the bounty, and the coordination required to bring down something so massive is within reach. This suggests Neanderthals had the social capacity to organize temporary aggregations, multiple bands coming together seasonally or for specific purposes, then dispersing back to their smaller groups. This is common among modern hunter-gatherers. Small bands for most of the year, larger gatherings during times of resource abundance or for social purposes like mate exchange and ceremony. The evidence appears at other elephant hunting sites across Europe. At sites in Germany, Italy and Spain, researchers find concentrations of elephant remains that suggest coordinated hunting by larger groups. These aren't accumulations over thousands of years. These are discrete events, single hunting episodes that required planning, coordination and cooperation between multiple family bands. But coordinating 50 to 100 people requires more sophisticated communication than coordinating 10. You need to get the word out, tell neighbouring bands that a herd has been spotted, agree on when and where to gather, assign roles during the hunt, divide the spoils afterward. This level of coordination suggests language, maybe not as complex as modern human language, but something more than gesture and demonstration. Some way to convey abstract information across space and time. The evidence for Neanderthal language is indirect but suggestive. Their hyoid bone, which anchors the tongue and larynx, is shaped like ours. Their inner ear anatomy suggests they could hear the same frequencies we use for speech. They had a version of the FOXP2 gene, which in modern humans is associated with language ability. They made complex tools that might have required verbal instruction to teach effectively, and they accomplish things that seem impossible without some form of linguistic communication. But we'll probably never know exactly what Neanderthal language sounded like or how complex it was. What we do know is that they communicated effectively enough to maintain sophisticated technologies across hundreds of thousands of years, complex enough to coordinate multi-band hunting expeditions, complex enough to establish and defend territories, complex enough to pass knowledge across generations, and that knowledge transmission was critical because Neanderthal technology didn't reset every generation. The Levallois technique persisted for over 200,000 years. Fire-making knowledge was maintained continuously. The best flint sources were remembered and returned to repeatedly. This is cumulative culture, information building on information, each generation learning from the previous one and adding their own innovations. But small populations are vulnerable to knowledge loss. If the only person who knows how to make birch bark tar dies without teaching someone else, that knowledge is gone. If the only individual who remembers where the good flint sources gets killed by a lion, that information vanishes. Small groups meant that every individual was a repository of crucial knowledge, and every death was potentially catastrophic. This created pressure for knowledge sharing and redundancy. Everyone needed to know the basics. Multiple people needed to know the critical skills. Teaching wasn't optional, it was survival, and the evidence suggests Neanderthals took it seriously. Sites with tool manufacturing remains often show evidence of learning, mistakes made by novices, cores broken during practice, points abandoned when errors couldn't be corrected. The social structure also had to account for the injured and elderly. Neanderthal fossils show individuals who survived catastrophic injuries. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found a male who had been blind in one eye, had a withered right arm and showed evidence of multiple healed fractures. He lived to about 40, which in Neanderthal terms was old age. Someone cared for him. Someone helped him when he couldn't help himself. This isn't universal among Neanderthals. Some individuals show evidence of dying from injuries that could have been survivable with care, but enough show evidence of long-term care that we know Neanderthal society had room for the disabled. This isn't purely altruistic. An elderly individual who can't hunt anymore can still teach, can still share knowledge, can still contribute to group survival through experience and wisdom. The social revolution that made Neanderthal successful wasn't about becoming more cooperative than other predators. Wolves cooperate, hyenas cooperate, lions cooperate. What made Neanderthals different was the flexibility and complexity of their cooperation. They could coordinate in small bands for daily hunting, they could aggregate into larger groups for megafauna hunts, they could maintain intergroup networks through female migration, they could care for the injured and learn from the elderly, they could pass knowledge across generations through teaching and observation. And they did all this with groups that were shockingly small by human standards. Modern humans achieved global dominance partly through forming large, complex societies. Neanderthals achieved apex predator status with bands of 10 to 20 people. This meant every individual mattered more, every relationship was more intense, every loss was more painful, but it also meant every person was known, valued, integral to their group's survival. By 50,000 years ago, the social structures that let Neanderthals rise from prey to predator were fully developed. Small, tight-knit bands connected through larger networks, male coalitions providing stability and coordination, female migration bringing diversity and connections, seasonal aggregations allowing large-scale cooperation, knowledge transmission, ensuring skills survived across generations, care for the injured preserving valuable experience. These weren't just social niceties, these were survival mechanisms, the foundation that everything else was built on. Without this social structure, their strength would have been wasted, their weapons would have been toys, their fire would have been decoration. But with it, with the ability to work together in flexible, sophisticated ways, they became something unprecedented. A thinking, planning, cooperating apex predator that could reshape ecosystems through sheer determination and collective action. The social revolution made them human in the truest sense. Not human as in our species, but human as in something more than animal, something that could overcome its biological limitations through cooperation and culture, something that could look at a 10-ton elephant and say, we can kill that, something that could face a cave lion and say, you don't scare us anymore, something that could claim an entire continent through nothing but stone, fire, and the bonds between individuals who refuse to face the darkness alone. By 130,000 years ago, Neanderthals had become something the Pleistocene had never seen before. Not the strongest predator, that title belonged to cave lions. Not the fastest, wolves could run them down. Not the toughest, bears were more resilient. But they were the most versatile, the most adaptable, the most capable of taking down prey that should have been untouchable. They were masters of the hunt. And the evidence of their mastery is written in bones scattered across 2 continents. Start with the prey animals themselves. Neanderthal sites contain remains from nearly every large mammal that lived in Pleistocene Europe. Red deer and reindeer, yes, those were staples, but also horses, bison, aurochs, the wild cattle that stood 6 feet at the shoulder, ibex living on mountain slopes, chamois in rocky terrain, wild boar in forests, and the true megafauna, the animals that make modern wildlife look small, woolly mammoths weighing 6 tons, woolly rhinoceroses armoured in thick hide, straight-tusked elephants reaching heights of 4 meters, even the occasional narrow-nosed rhinoceros or Merck's rhinoceros, creatures so massive they had virtually no natural predators. The diversity of prey tells us Neanderthals weren't specialised hunters tied to a single prey species. They were generalists who could adapt their tactics to whatever was available. In open steppes they hunted horses and bison. In forests they took red deer and wild boar. In mountains they pursued ibex. Near rivers, evidence suggests they caught fish and gathered shellfish, though their diet was still heavily meat-based. They were ecological opportunists, and that versatility was part of what made them successful. But it's not just that they hunted these animals, it's how they hunted them. The isotope evidence is particularly revealing. When scientists analyse the chemical composition of Neanderthal bones, specifically the ratios of nitrogen isotopes, They can determine what position an organism occupied in the food web. Herbivores have one signature, predators have another. Apex predators, creatures that eat other predators and have virtually nothing hunting them, have a distinctive signature showing very high nitrogen-15 levels. Neanderthal bones show nitrogen isotope ratios comparable to wolves and cave hyenas, not lower, suggesting they were scavenging or eating lower on the food chain, not just comparable, but sometimes higher, suggesting they were consuming the most prime, protein-rich tissues from prey animals. They were eating like apex predators, like animals at the absolute top of their food web. This is isotope proof that Neanderthals weren't just surviving, they were thriving, dominating, taking the best meat from the best animals, and they were selective. At multiple sites, analysis of prey remains shows Neanderthals preferentially targeting adult males in prime condition. This is counterintuitive hunting behavior. Most predators avoid prime adults because they're dangerous. A healthy adult red deer can kill a wolf with a kick. An adult bison can gore a lion. Prime animals fight back effectively, injuring or killing predators foolish enough to attack them. But Neanderthals had advantages that let them overcome this danger. The first advantage was ambush. Neanderthal anatomy, all that explosive power and sprint capacity, was optimized for ambush hunting in wooded or broken terrain. They weren't chasing animals across open plains. They were using forest cover to get close, incredibly close, before attacking. Evidence for this comes from multiple sources. The prevalence of woodland prey in their diet, the lack of projectile weapons designed for long-distance use, the injury patterns showing close-quarters violence. Imagine a hunt. You're part of a Neanderthal band moving through a dense forest in what will one day be France. It's autumn. The deer are in rut, males fighting for mating rights, distracted by hormones and competition. Your group has been tracking a large stag for hours. You know his patterns, where he feeds, where he rests. You've seen his tracks, read his signs in broken branches and disturbed earth. Now you're closing in. The band splits up. 3 individuals circle wide to the left using a gully for cover. 2 go right, staying downwind so the stag won't catch their scent. You and 2 others move directly forward, slow and quiet, using trees and shadows. Everyone knows their role. You've done this hundreds of times. The coordination is instinctive, practiced, refined over a lifetime of hunting together. The stag is ahead, feeding in a small clearing. He's huge, maybe 250 pounds of muscle and antler. Normally he'd be alert, constantly checking his surroundings, but he's distracted by a younger male nearby, a rival. His attention is divided. This is your moment. You signal. Everyone moves at once. The stag sees you immediately. He bolts. But he's running toward the other group, the ones who circled around. He doesn't know they're there until it's too late. They rise from cover, spears ready. The stag tries to change direction. Too slow. A spear catches him in the ribs, driven with enormous force by powerful arms and shoulders. The stone point penetrates deep, piercing lungs. The stag stumbles. Another spear, from a different angle, then another. Within seconds, it's over. The stag is down, dying, and your band is already beginning the butchery process. This is how Neanderthals hunted. Not with long chases, not with projectiles from a distance, with coordination, patience, and explosive violence at close range. The prey never had a chance because by the time they realized the danger, it was already too late. This is ambush predation at its finest, refined over hundreds of thousands of years into a deadly art. But ambush tactics only work on certain animals in certain terrain. What about mammoths on open steppes? What about rhinoceroses in treeless tundra? How do you ambush something that weighs 6 tons and can see for miles in every direction? The answer appears to be different tactics for different prey, flexibility, adaptation, using whatever advantage the terrain and circumstances provided. For mammoths and elephants, the evidence suggests Neanderthals used a combination of strategies. Sometimes they might have scavenged, taking advantage of animals that died from natural causes or were killed by other predators. But at sites like Newmark Nord, the systematic butchery and the targeting of adult males suggests active hunting, probably by driving animals into difficult terrain where their size became a disadvantage, probably with larger groups, 20 or more hunters, using fire to panic the animals and spears to finish them once they were disoriented or trapped. One fascinating line of evidence comes from La Côte de Saint-Brelade in Jersey, where archaeologists found mammoth and rhinoceros bones at the base of a cliff along with stone tools. The initial interpretation was that Neanderthals had driven these animals off the cliff deliberately, causing them to fall to their deaths. This would be sophisticated hunting, using the terrain as a weapon. However, this interpretation is now debated. The bone accumulations might represent natural deaths or scavenging rather than drive hunting. But the fact that researchers considered it plausible shows how capable Neanderthals had become. What's not debated is that Neanderthals regularly encountered and processed mammoths. Multiple sites across Europe show mammoth remains with cut marks from stone tools. At some sites, the bones show systematic dismemberment, indicating thorough processing. Mammoth hunting, whether through active pursuit or opportunistic scavenging, was part of the Neanderthal repertoire. These weren't rare events. These were regular occurrences across their range. The seasonality of hunting shows additional sophistication. At several sites, analysis of prey animal teeth reveals they were killed during specific seasons. At Grotte du Lazaret in France, evidence suggests Neanderthal conducted a major autumn hunt, killing 23 red deer, 6 ibex, 3 aurochs, and a roe deer in a single season. This represents careful planning and coordination, waiting for the right time when prey animals were grouped together for rut, striking when conditions were optimal, processing huge amounts of meat that might have been dried or smoked for storage through winter. The storage question is fascinating because if Neanderthals could preserve meat, it would dramatically change their survival prospects. Winter in Ice Age Europe was brutal. Prey animals migrated or became scarce. Hunting success dropped. Having stored food would mean the difference between surviving and starving. Evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Some sites show fire features that might have been used for smoking meat. Others show evidence of fat processing, rendering it for storage. But direct proof of stored food is difficult to find because preservation doesn't last. What we do have is evidence of Neanderthals using every part of prey animals. Bones show cut marks where meat was removed, then percussion marks where they were broken to extract marrow. This is maximum utilization, nothing wasted. In times of plenty, they might have been selective, taking only the best cuts, but evidence shows they could also survive on marginal foods when necessary. Bone marrow provides fat and calories when muscle tissue is scarce. Brains, tongues, organs, these fatty tissues would have been highly valued. The hunting weapons themselves evolved over time. The earliest Neanderthal spears were simple wooden shafts with fire-hardened points. By 250,000 years ago, they were adding stone tips, using the Levallois technique to create points with ideal shape and penetrating power. By 100,000 years ago, some points show evidence of being designed specifically for different purposes. Larger, heavier points for big game, smaller, lighter points for deer and medium-sized prey. This specialization suggests conscious tool design, making different weapons for different jobs, and they were maintaining their weapons carefully. Stone points that broke during use were often retouched and reused. Spear shafts show evidence of repair. This isn't surprising when you consider the investment required to make these tools, hours of work to create a single stone point, days to find and process the perfect wood for a shaft. These weren't disposable items. These were valuable tools maintained and cared for over extended periods. The coordination required for hunts varied with prey type. A single deer might require only 2 or 3 hunters working together. A mammoth might require 20 or more. But even small hunts demanded precise timing and communication. One person spooking the prey too early ruins the ambush for everyone. One person failing to block an escape route lets dinner get away. Success demanded trust, practice, and intimate knowledge of how your hunting partners would behave in any situation. This is where the small band size becomes an advantage. When you hunt with the same 5 or 6 people your entire life, you don't need elaborate signals. You know how they move. You know their strengths and weaknesses. You know who's fast and who's strong and who has the best aim. You can coordinate through tiny gestures, shifts in posture, glances. This kind of implicit coordination is incredibly effective and nearly impossible for larger, less cohesive groups to match. But hunting wasn't just about getting food. It was about maintaining status as apex predators. Every successful hunt reinforced Neanderthal dominance. Every defended kill told hyenas and wolves that this territory was claimed. Every mammoth brought down demonstrated that no prey was too large, no challenge too difficult. They were broadcasting their presence to the entire ecosystem. We're here. We're dangerous. This is our land. The fossil record of prey animals shows the impact of this hunting pressure. Some species show changes in population structure, more young animals surviving compared to earlier periods when large predators selected for different age classes. Migration patterns might have shifted as prey animals learned to avoid areas of concentrated Neanderthal activity. The entire ecology of Pleistocene Europe was being reshaped by a single predator species that had emerged from vulnerability just a few 100,000 years earlier. By 60,000 years ago, Neanderthals were at their peak as hunters. They occupied territories from Britain to Siberia, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. Everywhere they went, they were the apex predator, the species other carnivores had to account for. They'd mastered ambush hunting. They'd learned to coordinate large-scale attacks on megafauna. They'd developed diverse toolkits for different prey and purposes. They'd established territories and defended them successfully against competitors. They'd become, in every meaningful sense, masters of the hunt. But mastery came with a price, and that price was written in the bones of every Neanderthal who ever lived. Look at a Neanderthal skeleton. Any Neanderthal skeleton. It doesn't matter which one. The bones tell the same story. Written in healed fractures and compressed vertebrae and damaged joints is the price they paid for being apex predators. Because power doesn't come free. Dominance isn't given. It's earned through blood and pain and injuries that would cripple modern humans, but which Neanderthals endured as simply the cost of survival. The statistics are staggering. That study of 124 Neanderthal specimens we mentioned earlier, the one showing 74% with evidence of predator attacks, that's just the beginning. When you expand the analysis to include all forms of trauma, skeletal injuries from any cause, the numbers get even more dramatic. Over 80% of Neanderthal remains show evidence of significant traumatic injury. Broken bones, crushed vertebrae, skull fractures, joint damage. These weren't rare individuals who had bad luck. This was the norm. This was what being a Neanderthal meant. Start with the arms and hands. These are the body parts that would take the most abuse during close quarters hunting, and the fossil record shows it. Neanderthal arm bones frequently show healed fractures of the radius and ulna, the two bones of the forearm. These are defensive injuries, the kind you get when you raise your arms to block or deflect an attack. When a mammoth swings its trunk at your head and you instinctively throw up your arm to protect yourself, the arm breaks, the mammoth doesn't. But you survive because that broken arm saved your skull from being crushed. Hand bones show similar patterns. Fractures of the metacarpals, the bones in the palm of your hand, damage to finger bones. These injuries come from gripping spears during violent impacts, from holding onto weapons while prey animals thrash and struggle, from punching or striking during close combat. Your hands are your primary tools, you use them constantly, and every use puts them at risk. The ribs tell an even more dramatic story. Neanderthal rib cages frequently show healed fractures, sometimes multiple ribs broken on the same side, sometimes ribs broken at different times showing separate injury events. Broken ribs are excruciatingly painful. They make breathing difficult, they limit mobility, and they're usually caused by blunt force trauma. Being thrown against a tree, being trampled, being struck by a thrashing animal. In modern humans, broken ribs are serious injuries requiring weeks of careful recovery. Neanderthals apparently just kept going. The vertebral column, the spine, shows perhaps the most telling damage. Many Neanderthal spines show compression fractures. These occur when vertebrae are crushed by axial loading, force applied directly along the spine's length. You get these from falls, from being thrown, from impacts that compress your entire body. Each compression fracture represents a moment where the Neanderthal came close to being paralyzed or killed. Each one healed, but probably imperfectly, leaving chronic pain and reduced mobility. Skull fractures appear with disturbing frequency. These aren't the kind of injuries you get from accidents. These are the result of being struck in the head with tremendous force. Some show evidence of healing, meaning the individual survived. Others show no healing, meaning they died from the injury. The ones who survived skull fractures must have been unconscious for hours or days. They probably had concussions, maybe traumatic brain injuries, but they lived. Someone cared for them during recovery. Someone kept them alive despite injuries that should have been fatal. And then there are the injuries that didn't heal. The remains that show trauma and no evidence of healing, telling us these individuals died from their wounds. A crushed skull that shows no bone remodeling. A broken neck that severed the spinal cord instantly. A punctured rib cage that penetrated the lungs. These are the ones who didn't make it, the unsuccessful hunts, the moments when strength and skill and courage weren't enough. What's remarkable is the distribution of injuries. They appear across all age groups and both sexes. Children show trauma, adolescents show trauma, adults show trauma. Males and females both have broken bones and healed fractures. This tells us Neanderthal life was dangerous for everyone. There was no safe position, no role that exempted you from violence and injury. Whether you were a primary hunter or a support role, whether you were male or female, young or old, the Pleistocene was trying to kill you constantly. Researchers have tried to find modern analogues, populations that show similar trauma patterns. The closest match is professional rodeo riders, people who regularly interact with large, unpredictable animals weighing hundreds or thousands of pounds. People who get thrown, trampled, gored, crushed as a regular part of their occupation. The comparison is telling. Neanderthals lived their entire lives doing what modern humans consider so dangerous, we made it into an extreme sport. But it's not just the frequency of injuries that's significant. It's what they tell us about Neanderthal healing and resilience. Many of these fractures show evidence of complete healing. The bones knit back together. New bone formed at the fracture site. The individual survived not just the injury but the recovery period afterward. And recovery from major fractures without modern medicine is no joke. You're vulnerable. You can't hunt. You can't defend yourself. You need care from others. You need food provided by the group. You need protection. The fact that so many Neanderthals survived major injuries tells us their social bonds were strong enough to support the injured through recovery. A Neanderthal with a broken arm was kept alive by the band, fed, protected, given time to heal before being expected to contribute fully again. This is compassion, or maybe pragmatism. An experienced hunter with a broken arm is still valuable for their knowledge, their ability to teach, their social connections. But whatever the motivation, the care was there. Some individuals survived truly catastrophic injuries. The Shanidar 1 specimen from Iraq is perhaps the most famous example. This was an adult male who lived to approximately 40 years old, remarkable for a Neanderthal. But his life wasn't easy. He was blind or nearly blind in his left eye, possibly from a blow to the head early in life. His right arm was withered, significantly smaller and weaker than his left, probably from a birth defect or childhood injury. He had healed fractures on multiple ribs. He showed evidence of arthritis in multiple joints. And he had survived what appears to have been a crushing injury to his left foot. This individual couldn't have hunted effectively. He couldn't have contributed to the band in the traditional ways. But he lived to a relatively old age, which means the group kept him alive, valued him, found ways for him to contribute despite his disabilities. Maybe he was an exceptional toolmaker. Maybe he possessed valuable knowledge about resources and territories. Maybe he was just family and you don't abandon family. Whatever the reason, he wasn't left to die. He was cared for over decades. But not every injured Neanderthal received such care. Some skeletal remains show evidence of injuries that weren't properly treated, broken bones that healed at wrong angles, infections that spread through the skeleton, individuals who died from injuries that might have been survivable with better care. This suggests the care available varied. Maybe some bands were more compassionate or had more resources to devote to the injured. Maybe some injuries were so severe that care couldn't help. Maybe some individuals were simply unlucky. The caloric cost of maintaining a Neanderthal body, especially one that's constantly healing from injuries, was enormous. We talked before about how their baseline metabolism was higher than modern humans. Add in the energy demands of healing bone fractures, fighting off infections, repairing damaged tissue, and the numbers become staggering. Estimates suggest seriously injured Neanderthals might have needed 5,000 to 6,000 calories per day during recovery periods. That's 3 times what a modern sedentary adult needs. This created pressure on the entire band. Every injured member was someone who needed feeding but couldn't contribute to acquiring food. In times of abundance, this was manageable. But during hard winters or when prey was scarce, having multiple injured members could push a band to the edge of starvation. This might explain why some injured individuals didn't receive care. Not cruelty, but triage. The band couldn't support everyone, so the most severely injured were left to die so the rest could survive. The injury patterns also tell us about Neanderthal hunting strategies in ways that complement the other evidence. The preponderance of upper body injuries, particularly to arms and chest, confirms close-range hunting. If they were using projectile weapons from distance, you'd expect different injury patterns. More leg injuries from chasing, fewer defensive arm fractures. But the injuries we see are consistent with hunters who got right up next to dangerous prey and delivered killing blows at arm's length or less. Some specific injury types are particularly revealing. Neanderthals show high rates of what's called spondylolysis, a stress fracture in the vertebrae caused by repeated hyperextension of the spine. This is common in modern athletes who repeatedly arch their backs under load, gymnasts, weightlifters, throwers. In Neanderthals, it probably came from the repeated stress of thrusting spears with their entire body weight behind the blow. The motion hyperextended their spines, and over years or decades the repetitive stress caused fractures. Another telling pattern involves the shoulder complex. Neanderthal shoulder joints often show degenerative changes, arthritis, bone spurs, and roughened surfaces indicating chronic stress. These changes come from repetitive overhead or downward thrusting motions with heavy resistance. Exactly what you'd expect from decades of driving spears into large animals. Their shoulders were literally wearing out from use, but they kept using them because stopping wasn't an option. The teeth show another kind of damage. Neanderthal front teeth frequently show heavy wear, often worn down to the roots. They also show scratch marks and stone tool cut marks, evidence they were using their teeth as tools, holding hides while scraping them, gripping materials while cutting, using their mouths as a third hand during tool making or hide processing. This is common in many traditional cultures. Your teeth are useful tools. But it's hard on them. It causes wear, breakage, infections. And dental problems without modern dentistry can be agonizing and eventually fatal. Some Neanderthal skulls show evidence of abscessed teeth, infections that spread into the jawbone. These would have been extremely painful. Chronic, debilitating pain that never stopped. Some individuals lived for years with these conditions. Others probably died from infections spreading from their teeth into their bloodstream. Dental health, or the lack of it, was a constant source of suffering. But perhaps the most sobering evidence comes from the mortality patterns. When you look at the age distribution of Neanderthal remains, a clear picture emerges. Very few Neanderthals lived past 40. Most died in their 20s or 30s. Many died as children or adolescents. The average life expectancy, if you survived childhood, was probably around 30 to 35 years. Compared to modern humans, this seems tragically short. But compared to other Pleistocene predators, it's not unusual. Most large predators in the wild don't live to old age. They die from injury, disease, starvation, or being killed by competitors. What's unusual about Neanderthals is that despite these mortality rates, despite the constant injuries and short lives, they were successful. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They maintained populations across an enormous geographic range for hundreds of thousands of years. They must have had high birth rates to compensate for high mortality. They must have had effective child-rearing practices that got enough children to adulthood to maintain population levels. They must have been exceptionally tough and resilient to keep going, despite accumulating injuries that would disable most modern humans. The cost of power was high. Every hunt risked injury. Every winter risked starvation. Every territorial conflict risked death. The Neanderthal body plan, optimized for explosive power, demanded constant fuel. Their hunting strategy, based on close-range ambush, guaranteed injuries. Their small population sizes meant every death mattered critically. They were walking a knife's edge between success and extinction for their entire existence. But they did it. For 200,000 years they paid the price and kept going. They broke bones and healed them. They lost teeth and adapted. They watched band members die and mourned them, and moved on because stopping meant dying. They were tough in ways modern humans can barely imagine. Not tough because they didn't feel pain or fear. Tough because they felt all of it and kept hunting anyway. Because survival demanded it. Because their bodies and their culture and their entire existence was built around being apex predators, and apex predators don't get to rest. The fossil record is a testament to their resilience. Every healed fracture is a story of survival against odds. Every individual who lived to 30 is a victory over a world designed to kill them. Every band that persisted through winter is proof that determination and cooperation can overcome even the harshest conditions. The Neanderthals paid the cost of power, and for hundreds of thousands of years they counted it worthwhile. 60,000 years ago, Neanderthals stood at the absolute peak of their power. 200,000 years of evolution had refined them into the most formidable predators in Eurasia. They controlled territories from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Altai Mountains of Siberia, from the Mediterranean shores to the edges of the Arctic tundra. Wherever there were prey animals and shelter, there were Neanderthals, and wherever there were Neanderthals, they dominated. The archaeological sites from this period tell the story. Grotte de Rennes in France shows Neanderthals using sophisticated bone tools and wearing personal ornaments. Abric-Romanée in Spain preserves evidence of carefully organised living spaces with multiple hearths and dedicated work areas. Krapina in Croatia contains the remains of over 80 Neanderthals, suggesting either large social gatherings or a preferred burial location that bands returned to over generations. These aren't the archaeological signatures of struggling survivors. These are the traces of people who had mastered their world. The prey diversity during this period was remarkable. Analysis of Neanderthal sites from 70,000 to 40,000 years ago shows they were taking everything. Red deer and roe deer, yes, but also horses, aurochs, bison, reindeer, ibex, chamois. In coastal areas, they were catching seals and dolphins. In some regions, they were hunting woolly rhinoceros, animals that could weigh 3 tons and had horns up to 3 feet long. The fact that they could successfully hunt such a wide range of species, from small deer to mega herbivores, shows absolute confidence and capability. Some of the most impressive evidence comes from mammoth hunting sites. Mammoths weren't easy prey. A full-grown adult mammoth could stand 12 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh 6 tons. They had tusks that could grow 15 feet long. They lived in herds led by experienced matriarchs who had survived decades on the Ice Age steppes. They knew predators, they knew danger, and yet Neanderthals were killing them. The site of Salzgitter Lebenstedt in Germany, dated to around 50,000 years ago, shows clear evidence of mammoth butchery. Cut marks on bones from at least 20 mammoths, showing systematic disarticulation and meat removal. The hunting strategy probably involved targeting juveniles or sick individuals, the most vulnerable members of the herd. But even juvenile mammoths weighed over a ton. Killing them required coordinated group effort, multiple hunters working together with carefully planned tactics. The tool technology during this peak period reached remarkable sophistication. The Mousterian toolkit expanded to include specialized forms for specific tasks, different point styles for different prey, animals, backed knives with deliberately blunted edges for comfortable handheld use, denticulates with serrated edges for sawing through hide and sinew, scrapers of various shapes and sizes for processing different materials. This wasn't generic toolmaking. This was specialized craftsmanship adapted to specific needs. Some sites show evidence of tool curation, the practice of carrying preferred tools for long distances, maintaining them carefully, resharpening them multiple times before finally discarding them. This shows forward planning and attachment to particular implements. A hunter might carry the same spear point for months or years, knowing its balance and performance intimately. That point became part of them, an extension of their body shaped to their hand and fighting style. The use of fire during this period was completely mastered. Every Neanderthal site from this era shows evidence of controlled fire use, not occasional fires, but permanent hearths that were maintained continuously. The hearths at Abric-Romanée show this beautifully. 8 hearths arranged in an arc, spaced evenly apart, each one surrounded by a clear activity area where people sat and worked. The spacing suggests planning, creating zones for sleeping and working and social gathering. This is architecture. This is intentional space organization by people who knew exactly how they wanted their living areas arranged. The fires themselves show technological sophistication. At Pech de Lazay, remember, they were using manganese dioxide to lower combustion temperatures and make fires easier to start and maintain. This isn't just using fire. This is understanding fire chemistry well enough to manipulate it with additives. It's protochemistry, empirical science developed through experimentation and observation over generations. Fire gave them control over their environment in ways that went beyond simple warmth and cooking. Fire kept predators away, creating safe zones where even small bands could sleep without posting guards. Fire extended the day, allowing work to continue after sunset. Fire could be used to harden spear points, making them more durable. Fire could be used to process birch bark into tar for hafting. Fire was tool and weapon and companion, and Neanderthals wielded it with absolute confidence. Their relationship with caves during this period shows strategic thinking. They weren't just sheltering in caves randomly, they were choosing specific caves for specific purposes. Deep caves for winter hibernation sites where the temperature stayed stable, shallow rock shelters for summer camps with good views of game trails, cave mouths positioned to receive morning sun for warmth, locations near water sources but elevated enough to avoid flooding. Each site choice shows evaluation of multiple factors and selection of optimal locations, and they were actively managing predator competition. The evidence from multiple sites shows Neanderthals hunting cave lions, cave hyenas, wolves, and bears. Not opportunistically, but systematically. The skinning marks on carnivore bones suggest they were taking pelts, using predator furs for warmth and possibly status display. But the broader pattern suggests something more. They were reducing predator populations, claiming the best caves, eliminating competition for prey, restructuring ecosystems around themselves. By 60,000 years ago, in many regions, cave lion and cave hyena populations were declining noticeably. Not gone, but reduced. Less abundant, less dominant. The prey animals show corresponding changes. Species composition shifted. The animals that Neanderthals preferred to hunt, prime-age deer and reindeer, became more abundant relative to species they ignored. The ecosystems were adapting to Neanderthal presence, reorganizing around these apex predators who had seized control of the carnivore guild. The social practices during this period show increasing complexity. At Bruniquel Cave in France, dated to around 176,000 years ago, but showing practices that continued through the peak period, Neanderthal constructed mysterious structures deep in the cave using broken stalagmites, ring-shaped arrangements of stalagmite fragments, some burned by fire. The structures required breaking and moving over 2 tons of calcite. The purpose remains unknown. Ritual, social gathering, territorial marking? Whatever the reason, this represents planned construction for symbolic rather than purely functional purposes. Burial practices during the peak period show clear intentionality. Multiple sites contain Neanderthal remains in positions that suggest deliberate placement. Bodies arranged carefully, sometimes with apparent grave goods, stone tools or animal bones placed alongside. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints, an elderly male was buried in a pit that had been dug specifically for the burial. At Shanidar Cave, some researchers argue the bodies were placed on beds of flowers, though this interpretation is debated. Whether or not you accept the flower burial, the broader pattern is clear. Neanderthals were treating their dead with care. They weren't just abandoning bodies where they fell, they were engaging in practices that suggest awareness of death as significant, as worthy of ritual attention. This is consciousness reflecting on mortality. This is mind complex enough to contemplate its own ending, and find that contemplation meaningful enough to create practices around it. Personal ornaments appear during this period at multiple sites. Perforated shells and teeth strung as beads, pigments ground into powder, red ochre and black manganese dioxide applied to bodies or objects. Feathers from raptors, eagles and ravens, carefully removed and possibly worn. These ornaments weren't functional in the survival sense. You don't need a necklace to hunt deer. But they served social functions, identity markers, status symbols, artistic expression, evidence of minds that cared about appearance, and meaning beyond simple survival. Language during this period remains one of the great unknowns. We know Neanderthals had the physical capacity for speech. Their hyoid bone, which anchors the tongue and is crucial for articulate speech, is identical to modern humans. Their FOXP2 gene, associated with language in modern humans, shows evidence of positive selection. Their brains were large, with well-developed frontal lobes associated with language processing. They had everything needed for complex vocal communication, and logically they must have had language. The hunting strategies they used required coordination. The tool-making techniques required teaching. The social bonds that let them care for injured members required communication. The symbolic practices, burial and ornament use, required shared meaning. All of this points toward language sophisticated enough to convey complex information, plan future actions, teach skills, and create shared cultural understanding. But we can't hear them. We'll never know what a Neanderthal voice sounded like, or what words they used for mammoth or fire or home. Their language, if it existed, died with them. leaving us to infer its existence from the complexity of behaviours that seem impossible without it. This was the apex. This was the moment when 200,000 years of evolution had created a predator perfectly adapted to the Pleistocene world of Europe and Western Asia, strong enough to kill the largest prey, smart enough to outcompete other predators, tough enough to survive injuries that would kill other species, social enough to cooperate in groups and care for their members. This was success on every measurable level. And yet, there's a tragic irony in this success, because the very adaptations that made Neanderthals dominant in their world also made them vulnerable to change. Their bodies, optimized for power, required enormous amounts of food. Their hunting strategy, based on close-range ambush, worked perfectly in the forested and mixed environments of early glacial Europe. Their small band sizes, 10 to 20 individuals, were ideal for the prey densities and territories they exploited. Everything about them was perfectly adapted to their specific ecological niche. Then, around 50,000 years ago, something new entered their world. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, moving out of Africa and into Eurasia. These newcomers were different, less physically powerful, smaller, more graceful bodies, but they had different strategies. They hunted at range with sophisticated projectile weapons. They lived in larger groups, 50 to 100 individuals. They had more complex social networks spanning multiple bands. They were endurance specialists rather than power specialists. In open environments, particularly as Europe's climate became colder and forests gave way to tundra, the human adaptations became advantageous. Range weapons let them hunt without risk of injury. Larger groups let them take down prey through coordinated drives rather than individual strength. Endurance adaptations let them pursue wounded animals for days if necessary. They were playing a different game, using strategies Neanderthals weren't adapted for. The competition wasn't direct. Neanderthals and modern humans coexisted for thousands of years. They interbred. Modern humans carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. They probably traded. They might have cooperated occasionally. But gradually, inexorably, Neanderthal populations declined. Not through warfare, but through demographics. Slightly lower birth rates, slightly higher mortality, slightly worse survival during resource shortages. Over millennia, these small differences compounded. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were confined to refugia, isolated pockets in southern Europe and Western Asia. By 30,000 years ago, only a handful of populations remained. The last known Neanderthals survived in Gibraltar until approximately 28,000 years ago. Then they were gone. After 200,000 years of success, after achieving complete dominance over the Carnivore Guild, after becoming the apex predators of Pleistocene Eurasia, they disappeared. But here's what we need to remember. The Neanderthals didn't fail. They succeeded brilliantly for 200,000 years. That's longer than modern humans have existed as a distinct species. They survived multiple glacial cycles. They adapted to climate changes that would have destroyed less capable species. They transformed from hunted prey to dominant predators. They created complex cultures with technology and art and ritual. They were people, different from us but not inferior to us. Just differently adapted. And they're not entirely gone. That 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in modern humans isn't just genetic debris, it's functional. Some of it codes for immune system responses, some affects skin and hair characteristics, some influences metabolism. The Neanderthals live on in us, their genes mixed with ours, their adaptations continuing in our bodies. When you look at a reconstruction of a Neanderthal, you're not looking at a failure, you're looking at a success story, an evolutionary triumph. A species that took the power-body plan to its absolute limit and used it to dominate an entire continent. They were the apex predators of the Ice Age, and for 200,000 years they earned that title through strength and skill and absolute determination to survive. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in your DNA, if you're of European or Asian descent, there's a trace of them. A whisper of those powerful hunters who stood against cave lions and killed mammoths and carved meaning into the darkness of Ice Age caves. They're gone, but not forgotten. The apex predators of the Pleistocene, who rose from prey to dominance and left their mark on human history forever.